The black stallion stood in the center of the dusty corral, like a monument to rage and grief, its dark coat gleaming under the merciless Wyoming sun. Another cowboy hit the ground hard, blood streaming from his nose as laughter erupted from the fence line. Lin May watched from her porch in silence, her red silk dress a slash of color against the weathered wood. For 6 months, she'd issued the same challenge to every man who dared. If you're a real cowboy, ride him. Well, none had lasted more than 8 seconds. The horse wasn't wild. It was broken, and so was she. Before we begin, I invite you to stay with this story until the very end. If it moves you, please hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this tale has traveled. Now, let's begin. The wind carried dust and rumors across the valley in equal measure. By the time Daniel Cross heard about the Chinese widow and her impossible horse, the story had grown teeth. Some said the stallion had killed 3 men. Others claimed the widow was a witch who'd cursed the animal to protect a fortune in hidden gold. Daniel didn't believe in curses, but he believed in grief. He'd carried enough of it himself. He first saw her on a Tuesday standing at the edge of the Carson Creek that marked the boundary between their properties. She wasn't looking at the water. Her gaze was fixed on something distant, something only she could see. The red silk dress she wore seemed like defiance itself, too bright and too beautiful for a land that wanted everyone the same shade of dust and resignation. Daniel had been checking his fence line when he spotted her. He didn't approach. Something about the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her hands were clasped tight in front of her, told him she was holding herself together by sheer force of will. He knew that posture. He'd worn it himself for the better part of 2 years after Sarah died. Instead, he just tipped his hat, a gesture she couldn't see from that distance, and went back to his work. But the image stayed with him, a woman in red beside gray water, as still as a painting and twice as lonely. The town of Thornfield wasn't much to speak of. A main street lined with buildings that had seen better decades, a saloon that never closed, and a general store run by a woman who knew everyone's business before they did. The railroad had promised to come through 5 years ago, but the rails had gone 20 miles south instead, leaving Thornfield to slowly fossilize into legend. Daniel made the trip into town once a week for supplies, no more and no less. He kept his head down, spoke only when spoken to, and tried to ignore the way certain folks looked at him, with pity or curiosity or that particular combination of both that made his jaw tight. "Heard you got a new neighbor," Samuel Garrett said, leaning against the counter of his general store with the casual posture of a man settling in for a long conversation. Samuel was 70 if he was a day, with a beard that reached his chest and an opinion on everything under the sun. "Seems so," Daniel replied, counting out coins for flour and coffee. "Chinese woman, widow." Samuel's tone suggested this was information of great import. Husband died 6, maybe 7 months back. Fall from a horse, they say. Left her that black devil in the corral and nothing else. Daniel had heard the story already, 3 different versions, each one more dramatic than the last. He didn't respond. "She's been challenging men to ride it," Samuel continued, undeterred by Daniel's silence. "Started about a month after the funeral. Just stands there in that red dress and says the same thing every time. If you're a real cowboy, ride him." He shook his head. "Tom Bradshaw tried last week. Horse threw him so hard he couldn't walk straight for 2 days." "Maybe folks should leave it alone then," Daniel said quietly. Samuel laughed, a dry sound like wind through dead leaves. "You'd think, but you know how men are. Every one of them thinks he'll be the one to do it, like it's some kind of test of manhood." He paused, studying Daniel with shrewd old eyes. "You gonna try?" "No." "Smart man." Samuel bagged the supplies. "Though I suppose everyone's got their reasons. That woman's carrying something heavy. You can see it in the way she moves, like she's afraid if she puts it down she'll fall apart completely." Daniel thought about the figure in red by the creek, motionless as a statue. "Maybe she's got a right to carry it however she wants." "Maybe so," Samuel agreed, "but this valley's got a way of taking what you try to hold too tight, squeezes it right through your fingers until there's nothing left but dust and regret." The words followed Daniel home, settling into the spaces between his thoughts. That night, he stood on his own porch and looked across the darkening valley toward the neighboring ranch. A single light burned in the window of the house, small and distant, like a star that had fallen to earth and gotten lost. He wondered if she was sitting alone in that light, surrounded by silence and memories. He wondered if she ever got tired of being strong. Then he turned away and went inside, because wondering didn't change anything, and he'd learned that lesson the hard way. Sunday brought riders. Daniel heard them before he saw them, whooping and hollering as they galloped down the valley road, kicking up a dust cloud that hung in the still air like smoke. 6 men, maybe 7, all heading in the same direction, toward the widow's ranch, toward the challenge. He told himself it wasn't his business. He had his own work to do, a fence that needed mending on the north pasture, a wagon wheel that had cracked and needed replacing. He told himself to stay out of it, but his hand stilled on the fence post and he found himself listening, waiting. The sounds came about 20 minutes later, shouting, the thunder of hooves, a crash that could only be a body hitting the ground. Then laughter, the kind of laughter that had edges, sharp and mean. Daniel set down his tools and started walking. He approached from the creekside, following the boundary line, until the widow's ranch came into view. The corral was easy to spot. A crowd of men clustered around the fence, their horses tied to the rail. In the center of the corral, the black stallion stood with its head high, ears pinned back, muscles quivering with tension. And there, on the porch of the house, stood Lin May. She was smaller than he'd expected. Not delicate. There was nothing delicate about the way she held herself, but compact, with a spine like iron and eyes that missed nothing. The red dress moved slightly in the breeze, the only soft thing about her. A young cowboy was picking himself up from the dust, his friends jeering good-naturedly as he limped toward the fence. His face was flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Maybe you should try asking it nicely, Jimmy," one of them called out. "Shut up, Hank," Jimmy muttered, climbing through the fence rails. "Who's next?" The voice came from the porch. May's English was clear, barely accented, but there was something formal about it, as if she were speaking a language learned from books rather than conversation. "The challenge stands. If you're a real cowboy, ride him." There was something ritualistic about the way she said it, Daniel realized, like a prayer or an incantation. She'd spoken these words so many times they'd become armor. "I'll give it a go," said a tall man with a scar across his cheek. Daniel recognized him, Jack Morrison, a drifter who worked odd jobs around the valley and had a reputation for being handy with his fists. Morrison swaggered into the corral, rope in hand. The stallion watched him come, every line of its body screaming danger. But Morrison was confident, probably drunk, and definitely stupid. He moved fast, trying to get the rope around the horse's neck before it could react. The stallion exploded. It happened so fast Daniel almost missed it. One moment Morrison was reaching out, the next he was airborne, sailing over the fence to land in a heap 10 feet away. The horse hadn't even let him touch it. The crowd roared with laughter, but Daniel wasn't watching them. He was watching May. Her face was stone. No satisfaction, no pleasure, no emotion at all. She simply stood there, waiting for the next one, and the next, and the one after that. This wasn't entertainment for her, Daniel realized. This was penance. He stayed through 3 more attempts. Each one ended the same way. Man on ground, horse untouched, crowd laughing like it was all a grand show. And through it all, May stood silent on her porch, a statue in red silk, watching something die over and over again. When the men finally gave up and rode away, still laughing and making bets about who'd try next Sunday, Daniel found himself alone at the fence. The stallion stood in the center of the corral, sides heaving, eyes wild. There was foam at its mouth and dust covered its black coat like ash. "You should go too." Daniel turned. May had come down from the porch and was standing about 15 feet away. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the way her hands gripped her elbows as if holding herself together. "Wasn't planning to ride," Daniel said. "Then why are you here?" It was a fair question. Daniel looked back at the horse, then at her. Seemed wrong, is all. What they're doing. Something flickered in her eyes. "They do what I ask them to do. Doesn't make it right." They stood in silence for a moment. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Somewhere a crow called out, harsh and lonely. "You don't know anything about it," May said finally. Her voice was quieter now, but harder. "You don't know why." "No, ma'am, I don't." Daniel met her gaze. But I know what grief looks like. And I know what it looks like when someone's punishing themselves. Her face went very still. For a moment, he thought she might order him off her property. Then she simply turned and walked back toward the house, the red silk of her dress catching the afternoon light. "Go home, Mr. Cross," she said without looking back. "This isn't your concern." She knew his name. Somehow, that surprised him more than anything else that had happened. He left, but the image stayed with him. The woman in red, the black horse, and the weight of something unspoken hanging between them like smoke. That night, Daniel dreamed of Sarah for the first time in months. She was standing in the doorway of their old house, backlit by golden light, and she was saying something he couldn't quite hear. He woke before dawn with the dream already fading, leaving behind only a dull ache and the familiar taste of loss. He made coffee and stood on his porch, watching the sun rise over the valley. The light came slowly, turning the sky from black to gray to rose gold, beautiful and indifferent, the way all sunrises were. His gaze drifted toward the neighboring ranch. He wondered if May was awake too, standing at her own window, watching the same light touch the same hills. He wondered if she ever got tired of being alone. The days that followed fell into their usual rhythm. Daniel worked his land, tended his small herd of cattle, fixed the things that broke, and accepted the things that couldn't be fixed. But his awareness of the neighboring ranch had sharpened. He found himself noting the smoke from her chimney in the morning, the lamp in her window at night, and he found himself walking to the creek more often. It was there he saw her again, 3 days after the Sunday gathering. She was kneeling at the water's edge, washing something, cloth maybe, or vegetables from a garden he couldn't see. The red dress was gone, replaced by simple dark cotton that made her seem smaller, more vulnerable. Daniel approached slowly, making noise so he wouldn't startle her. She looked up when he was still 20 feet away, her body tensing like an animal ready to bolt. "Morning," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. She studied him for a long moment before responding. "Mr. Cross." "Just Daniel is fine." He gestured toward the creek. "This is good water. I've been meaning to thank whoever maintains the upper dam. Keeps it flowing steady even in dry years. My husband built that dam." Her voice was flat, factual. 5 years ago. "He did good work." May returned to her washing, her hands moving in the water with quick, efficient motions. Daniel stood there, uncertain whether he should leave or stay. The silence stretched out, not quite comfortable but not hostile either. "The horse," May said suddenly, not looking up. "His name is Ha-Yun. It means black cloud in my language." Daniel nodded slowly. "It's a good name. Suits him. My husband raised him from a colt. They were—" She paused, searching for the word. "Connected. When Liang died, Ha-Yun was there. He saw it happen. Since then, he will not let anyone ride him." The pieces began to fall into place. The horse's rage, the widow's challenge, the ritualistic quality of it all. "You're trying to help him let go," Daniel said quietly. May's hand stilled in the water. "I am trying to help us both." She stood then, gathering the wet cloth into a basket. Her face was composed again, the brief moment of openness already closing. "The men who come on Sundays, they think it's a game, a test. They don't understand that some things cannot be won, only released." Then why keep asking them to try?" "Because I don't know what else to do." The words came out sharp, almost angry. Then she took a breath, steadying herself. "I thought if someone could ride him, if Ha-Yun could accept someone new, then maybe—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "It was foolish." "It's not foolish to want things to heal," Daniel said. May looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the kind that came from holding on too tight for too long. "Your wife," she said. "She died too. I heard people talk. 2 years ago, fever. I'm sorry." "So am I." They stood on opposite sides of the creek, two people bound by losses they'd never asked for and couldn't put down. The water moved between them, steady and indifferent, while the morning sun climbed higher in a cloudless sky. "I should go," May said finally. "There is work to do." "I'll be here tomorrow," Daniel said, "by the creek, if you want to talk, or not talk." Either's fine. She didn't respond, just turned and walked back toward her house, the basket balanced on her hip. But the next morning, when Daniel came to the creek with his fishing rod, she was there too, sitting on a flat rock with her feet in the water. They didn't talk much that day, or the next, but slowly, carefully, something began to shift. The following Sunday brought a smaller crowd, only 4 men this time, and none of them particularly serious. Daniel watched from the creekside again, far enough away to avoid being part of the spectacle, but close enough to see. The pattern was the same. Men entered the corral, full of swagger and confidence. The stallion sent them flying. The crowd laughed. May stood on her porch like a sentinel, her face revealing nothing. But when the men had gone and the dust had settled, Daniel saw her walk to the corral fence. She stood there for a long time, just looking at Hayun. The horse stood at the far side of the enclosure, as far from her as he could get. Daniel saw her shoulders shake once, just once, before she straightened and walked back to the house. That night, he made a decision. The next morning, he was at the creek before dawn. When May arrived, he was already there, sitting on the bank with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one without a word. They sat in silence as the sky lightened, watching the water catch and throw back the growing light. It was May who spoke first. "You think I'm cruel," she said quietly, "making Hayun go through this every week." "I think you're desperate," Daniel replied. "There's a difference. In my country, we have a saying, when the tree falls, the shadow runs. It means when someone dies, their influence remains. Their shadow." She took a sip of coffee. "Liang's shadow is very long. It covers everything." "Is that why you wear the red dress on Sundays?" May looked at him, surprised. "You noticed. Hard not to." "It was his favorite. He bought it for me in San Francisco before we came here." Her fingers tightened on the cup. "I wear it to remember, to honor him, but also—" She stopped, struggling with the words. "To punish yourself," Daniel finished softly. She didn't deny it. They sat in silence again, but it felt different now, closer to understanding. "I was not a good wife," May said finally. "I complained about this place. I hated the isolation, the cold, the way people looked at me in town. I wanted to go back to San Francisco, back to where there were others like us. We argued about it the morning he died. He rode out angry, and he never came back. And you think his death was your fault, wasn't it?" She turned to him, and he saw the rawness in her eyes. "If I had been grateful, if I had been quiet, if I had loved this place the way he wanted me to." "He still would have died," Daniel interrupted gently. "Horses fall, men die. You can't argue with that kind of randomness. Believe me, I've tried." May looked away, blinking hard. "You speak as if you know." "My wife and I had a fight the night before she got sick. Something stupid. I can't even remember what it was about now. But I remember I slept in the barn because I was too proud to apologize. The next morning, she had a fever. 3 days later, she was gone." He set down his coffee cup. "I spent 6 months thinking if I'd just slept in the house, if I'd noticed she was getting sick earlier, I could have saved her. But that's not how life works. Death doesn't wait for us to make amends or say the right words. It just comes." They were quiet for a long time after that. The creek flowed on, patient and eternal, while 2 people sat on its banks and let old wounds breathe in the morning air. "What did you do?" May asked finally. "To stop blaming yourself?" "I'm not sure I have stopped," Daniel admitted. "But I'm trying. Some days are better than others." May nodded slowly. "The horse," she said. "Hayun. When the men ride him, or try to, I tell myself I'm doing it for him, to help him heal, but maybe—" She took a shaky breath. "Maybe I'm just forcing him to relive it over and over. Maybe I'm keeping us both trapped." "Maybe," Daniel agreed. "Or maybe you just haven't found the right way yet." "And what is the right way?" He thought about that, watching the light play on the water. "I don't know. But I don't think it involves making him fight every Sunday." May was silent for a moment. Then she asked, "What would you do?" "I'd start by asking what he needs, not what I think he should need. And I'd give him time." Daniel met her eyes, same as I'd do for a person. Something in her face shifted, not quite hope, but maybe the shadow of it. "You sound like you understand horses." I understand grief, Daniel said, and I'm starting to think grief works about the same in every creature that feels it. The sun was fully up now, warming the valley and burning off the last of the morning mist. May stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "Thank you," she said, "for the coffee and the conversation." "Same time tomorrow?" Daniel asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, same time." As she walked away, Daniel noticed she moved a little lighter, as if some small weight had been lifted. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, he thought, a beginning was all you could ask for. The mornings by the creek became routine. They'd meet at dawn, share coffee Daniel brought from his house, and talk, sometimes about their lost spouses, sometimes about the valley, sometimes about nothing in particular. May was educated. She'd been a teacher's daughter in China before coming to America, and she spoke with a precision that made Daniel choose his own words more carefully. He learned that she'd come to San Francisco when she was 17, part of a small group of women escaping difficult circumstances. She'd met Liang there. He'd been working in a restaurant, saving money to buy land. They'd married quickly, within 3 months, and moved to Wyoming to start a ranch. Everyone said it was foolish, she told him one morning, a Chinese man buying land in cowboy country. But Liang was stubborn. He believed in America, in the promise of it. He thought if we worked hard enough, we could belong. "Did you believe that too?" Daniel asked. May smiled, but it was sad. "I wanted to, but belonging isn't something you can earn through hard work. Either people let you in, or they don't." Daniel thought about the way Samuel Garrett had described her, Chinese woman, widow, as if those were the only facts that mattered. He thought about the men who came to ride the horse, treating it like entertainment, never once asking if she needed help with the ranch or the work. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" "For how this place has treated you." May looked at him for a long moment. "You're the first person to apologize for that." Should have been the first of many then." They fell into silence, but it was comfortable now. Daniel had learned the shape of her silences, when they meant she was thinking, when they meant she was hurting, when they simply meant she was at peace. He told her about Sarah, too, in pieces, how they'd met at a church social, how she'd had a laugh that made everyone around her smile, how she'd been the one to convince him to buy the ranch in the first place. "She saw something in this land I couldn't see," he said. "Said it had good bones. Said we could build a life here." He paused. "She was right, I suppose. Just didn't get to see it through." "Do you still love her?" May asked quietly. "Every day," Daniel said without hesitation. "But it's different now. Less like an open wound, more like an old scar. Still there, still tender, but I can live with it." May nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Liang used to say I had too much fire, that I burned too hot, worried too much, felt too much. He was always calm, always steady, like a mountain." She looked toward her ranch where Haiyun's corral was just visible in the distance. "Now I think maybe that fire was just life. And he's gone, and I'm still burning, and I don't know what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything with it," Daniel said. "You just have to let it burn until it doesn't anymore." She turned to him, something fierce and grateful in her expression. "You're a strange man, Daniel Cross. You say things that should be simple, but they feel like permission." "Permission for what?" "To stop trying so hard to fix everything." That Sunday, only 2 men showed up to ride the horse. Daniel watched from the creek again, and this time when the second rider failed and the small crowd dispersed, May didn't stay on the porch. She walked to the corral, and Daniel saw her stand there for a long time, just watching Haiyun. Then she did something he'd never seen her do before. She opened the corral gate and left it open. The stallion stood at the far end, watching her warily. May didn't approach him. She just stood by the open gate, waiting. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then Haiyun took a step forward, then another. Slowly, cautiously, he moved toward the opening, toward freedom. At the last moment he stopped. His head came up, nostrils flaring, testing the air. Then he turned and walked back to the center of the corral, as if the open gate was more frightening than the fence. May closed the gate without a word and walked back to the house. That night, Daniel found her by the creek. She was sitting on the bank, her feet in the water, her face tilted up to the darkening sky. I thought if I gave him the choice, he would leave, she said when Daniel sat down beside her. I thought maybe he was only staying because he was trapped. Maybe he's staying because it's all he knows, Daniel suggested. Sometimes creatures choose the cage even when the door's open. Seems safer than the alternative. May looked at him. Are we still talking about the horse? I don't know. Are we? She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face. You're very wise for a cowboy, Daniel Cross. Just old and stubborn, he said, but he smiled back. They sat together as the stars came out, one by one, filling the sky with cold, distant light. The creek moved past their feet, patient and eternal, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something like peace settle over him. Not happiness, not yet, but maybe the promise of it, the shadow of it, moving just ahead in the darkness, waiting to be found. When May finally stood to go, she paused and looked back at him. No more challenges, she said. No more Sundays. I'm done with that. What will you do instead? I don't know yet, she admitted. But I know it needs to be different. Something that helps instead of hurts. If you need help figuring it out, Daniel said, I'm right next door. I know, May said softly. I've always known. She left then, walking back toward the house with the red dress and the impossible expectations. But her steps seemed lighter, and for the first time since he'd met her, Daniel thought she looked like someone who might believe in tomorrow. He stayed by the creek until the moon rose, silver and full, turning the water to mercury. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called out, and another answered. The valley was full of voices if you knew how to listen. The wind in the grass, the water over stones, the distant sound of horses settling in for the night. Daniel stood and turned toward home, but he paused to look back at the neighboring ranch one more time. The lamp was lit in May's window, a small warm point in the darkness. He thought about the black stallion, trapped by grief and fear. He thought about the woman in the red dress, punishing herself for crimes she didn't commit. He thought about himself, 2 years a widower, still learning how to live in a world that had moved on without him. And he thought about what might happen if 3 broken things stopped trying to fix themselves and just learned to exist together, in all their sharp and unhealed edges. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't even a plan. But as Daniel walked home under the watching stars, he thought it might be enough. The morning after May canceled the challenges, Daniel woke to find frost on the windows and silence where there should have been distant voices. Sunday had come again, but this time there would be no riders, no spectacle, no men treating grief like a game to be won. He made coffee and stood on his porch, watching smoke rise from May's chimney in a thin gray line. The valley was quiet except for the wind moving through the dry grass, a sound like whispered secrets. He wondered what she was thinking, alone in that house with a decision made and the weight of an empty day ahead. By the time he reached the creek, she was already there. But she wasn't sitting peacefully as she usually did. She was standing at the edge of the water, her arms wrapped around herself, staring toward her ranch, with an expression that made Daniel's chest tighten. Second thoughts? He asked gently. May shook her head. No, not about stopping the challenges. She turned to look at him, and he saw fear in her eyes. But now I don't know what comes next. For 6 months, every Sunday I knew exactly what would happen. Men would come, they would fail, and I would stand there and watch. It was terrible, but it was something. Now there's just nothing. Daniel understood that particular kind of vertigo, the moment when you stepped off the edge of grief's rituals and realized you had no idea how to fill the space they left behind. He'd felt it the first time he'd woken up and forgotten, just for a second, that Sarah was gone. The joy of that forgetting had been immediately swallowed by the crash of remembering, and for weeks afterward he'd been terrified of those blank morning moments. Nothing is harder than something, he said, even when the something hurts. Yes. May's voice was barely above a whisper. Exactly that. They stood in silence for a while. The sun was climbing higher, burning off the frost, turning the world from silver to gold. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals Daniel couldn't see, and he watched it until it disappeared beyond the ridge. I need to check my cattle today, he said finally. North pasture. It's good riding country up there. You can see 3 valleys from the high point. You want to come? Might help to get away from the ranch for a bit. May looked surprised. I don't ride anymore, not since Liang died. We can walk if you prefer. It's only about 2 miles. She hesitated, and he could see her weighing it, the comfort of isolation against the risk of something new. Finally, she nodded. All right, but I need to change into proper clothes first. I'll wait here, Daniel said. She returned 20 minutes later wearing dark cotton trousers and a heavy jacket, her long hair braided and pinned up. Without the red dress, she looked younger, less like a monument to loss and more like a woman trying to find her footing in unfamiliar terrain. They walked along this creek first, following it upstream where the water ran faster and clearer over smooth stones. Daniel pointed out landmarks, an old lightning-struck pine that served as a boundary marker, a cluster of rocks where he'd once found arrowheads, the remains of a line cabin from the early days when this valley had been open range. You know this land well, May observed. Spent 2 years learning it, Daniel said. Sarah used to say I talked to the dirt more than I talked to her. He smiled at the memory. She wasn't entirely wrong. Liang was the same way. He could look at soil and tell you what would grow there, what wouldn't. He knew every inch of our land. Her voice caught slightly. I never paid enough attention. I was always looking at what was missing instead of what was there. And now? Now I'm trying to see it the way he did, but it's hard. Everywhere I look, I see his work, his hands, his vision. I don't know where I fit in any of it. They climbed steadily as they talked, the land rising beneath them in long, sweeping folds. The air grew thinner and cleaner, carrying the scent of sage and pine. By the time they reached the high point Daniel had mentioned, they were both breathing hard. But the view was worth it. 3 valleys spread out below them like a map drawn in grass and stone and shadow. To the east, Thornfield sat small and distant, barely more than a collection of toy buildings. To the west, the mountains rose in jagged peaks, already white with early snow. And to the north, the land rolled on forever, empty and endless and beautiful. Oh, May said softly. It was all she said, but it was enough. They sat on a flat boulder, passing a canteen of water back and forth, saying nothing. Daniel had learned that May didn't need conversation to fill silence. She was comfortable with quiet in a way that reminded him of himself. It was one of the things he'd come to value about their mornings together. I used to hate this view, May said eventually. When Liang would bring me up here, I'd look at all that emptiness and feel like I was disappearing into it, like I'd become so small the world would forget I existed. And now? She considered the question, her eyes scanning the valleys below. Now, I think maybe that's not such a terrible thing, being small, being forgotten. Maybe it means you're finally free to be whatever you choose instead of whatever everyone expects. Daniel nodded slowly. Sarah believed in making noise. She thought if you were quiet, people would walk right over you. But after she died, I found I didn't have any noise left in me. For a long time, I thought that meant I was broken. He paused. But maybe I was just learning a different way of taking up space. By being silent, by being steady, present, not trying to fill every moment with something big. He looked at her. You do that too, you know. You're one of the most present people I've ever met. May blinked, clearly surprised. I always thought I was running away. From memory, from pain, from the future. Maybe you can do both. Be present and be running. At least until you figure out where you're actually trying to go. She smiled at that, a real smile that reached her eyes. You have a strange way of making complicated things sound simple, Daniel Cross. That's because most complicated things are simple at the core. We just add all the other layers ourselves. They sat on the boulder until the sun was high overhead, talking about everything and nothing. May told him about growing up in a village outside Guangzhou, about learning English from missionary teachers, about the terror and excitement of getting on a ship to America with nothing but a small trunk of belongings. Daniel told her about growing up on a struggling farm in Missouri, about Sarah's determination to head west, about the first time he'd seen this valley and known it would be home. Their stories wound around each other like the creek they'd followed up the mountain, separate but parallel, occasionally touching, always flowing in the same direction. When they finally stood to head back down, May paused and looked at him. Thank you, she said. For this. For getting me away from the ranch. Any time, Daniel said. And he meant it. The walk back down was easier, gravity pulling them forward, their legs remembering the path. But as they approached the creek where they'd started, May suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" Daniel listened. At first he heard nothing unusual: wind, water, birds. Then he caught it, the high, distressed sound of a horse calling out. They both started running. By the time they reached May's ranch, the source of the sound was obvious. Hayun was in the corral, but he wasn't alone. A young mare had somehow gotten into the enclosure, probably jumped the fence on the eastern side where the rails were lower, and the stallion was frantic. He was circling the mare head high, calling out with a sound that was part warning, part desperation. "That's Mrs. Patterson's mare," May said, breathing hard. "She must have broken loose from their property." The mare was clearly terrified of the agitated stallion. She huddled against the far fence, eyes rolling white, while Hayun paced between her and the gate like a sentry guarding a prisoner. "We need to separate them before someone gets hurt," Daniel said. "You have a rope?" May ran to the barn and came back with 2 coils of good rope. Daniel took one and studied the situation. Hayun was too worked up to approach directly, and the mare was too scared to respond to normal coaxing. "I'll try to get the mare's attention," Daniel said. "Draw her toward the gate. Can you keep Hayun distracted on the other side?" May hesitated. "I haven't been in the corral with him since Liang died." "You don't have to go in. Just stand by the fence on the far side. Maybe call to him. He knows your voice." She nodded, her face pale but determined. While she moved into position, Daniel climbed carefully over the fence on the side closest to the mare. He moved slowly, keeping his body language soft and non-threatening. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "Nobody's going to hurt you. We're just going to get you home." The mare's ears flicked toward him, but she didn't move. Behind him, he could hear Hayun's breathing, harsh and rapid. The stallion was watching every move Daniel made, ready to charge if he perceived a threat. Then May's voice rang out, clear and strong, speaking in Chinese. Daniel didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, gentle, soothing, familiar. It was the voice of someone calling a loved one home. Hayun's head swung toward her. For a moment he stood perfectly still, every muscle tense. Then he took a step toward the far fence, toward May. Daniel didn't waste the opportunity. He moved quickly but smoothly, getting the rope around the mare's neck and leading her toward the open gate. She resisted for a second, then seemed to understand and followed him. Within moments, they were both outside the corral, and Daniel was closing the gate behind them. Hayun stood in the center of the enclosure, his sides heaving, watching May. She stood at the fence, her hands gripping the top rail, tears streaming down her face. "You came to me," she whispered. "You heard me, and you came." The stallion took another step toward her, then another. Slowly, cautiously, he approached the fence until he was close enough that May could have reached out and touched him. She didn't. She just stood there, crying and speaking softly in Chinese, while the horse who'd refused all contact for 6 months stood within arm's reach and listened. Daniel quietly led the mare away, giving them space. He'd return her to the Patterson ranch later. Right now, something more important was happening, and he wasn't going to interrupt it. He was halfway to his own property when May caught up with him. Her face was flushed, her eyes red, but there was something light in her expression that he'd never seen before. "He remembered," she said, slightly breathless. "My voice. The words I used to say to him. He remembered." "Animals don't forget the people who matter to them," Daniel said gently. "I thought he hated me. I thought he blamed me for Liang's death. He was scared, just like you were. Sometimes fear looks a lot like hate." May pressed her hands to her face, and for a moment Daniel thought she might break down completely. Instead, she took a deep breath and lowered her hands, composing herself with visible effort. "I think," she said carefully, "that I've been wrong about many things. About what Hayun needed. About what I needed." She looked at Daniel. "About being alone." "You don't have to be alone," Daniel said quietly. "Not if you don't want to be." "Is that what we're doing? Not being alone?" "I think so, if that's all right with you." May nodded slowly. "It's more than all right. It's—" She struggled for the word. "Necessary. Like water or air. I didn't realize how much until now." They stood in the long grass between their properties, The afternoon sun warm on their faces, and something unspoken passed between them. Not romance. It was too soon for that, too fragile, but recognition. The understanding that they were both trying to survive the same storm, and maybe surviving was easier when you weren't doing it alone. "I should return this mare," Daniel said finally, gesturing to the animal grazing peacefully beside him. "And I should check the fence line, see how she got in." May paused. "But tomorrow morning, the creek?" "I'll bring the coffee," Daniel said. That night, Daniel lay in bed and thought about the look on May's face when Haiyun had responded to her voice. It was the look of someone discovering they hadn't lost everything after all, that something they'd thought was gone forever might still be retrievable if they were brave enough to reach for it. He thought about Sarah, about the fight they'd had, about all the words he'd never said. For 2 years he'd carried the weight of those unspoken things, convinced they mattered, convinced they'd made a difference in the end. But maybe they hadn't. Maybe Sarah had known he loved her despite the argument, despite his pride, despite all his failings. Maybe love didn't require perfect words or perfect timing. Maybe it just required showing up day after day and trying. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. The next week brought the first real cold. Frost covered the ground each morning, and ice formed along the creek's edge in delicate crystalline patterns. Daniel and May met as usual, but now they came prepared with heavier coats and gloves, and they stayed a little longer each time, as if reluctant to return to their separate solitudes. May talked about Haiyun more now, how she'd started spending time near the corral, not trying to touch him, but just being present. How the stallion would watch her from a distance, sometimes approaching the fence when she spoke in Chinese, sometimes staying far away. "It's like we're learning each other again," she said one morning, "as if we're both different people now than we were before." "You probably are," Daniel said. "Grief changes everything, even the things you think should stay the same." "Did it change you? After Sarah died?" Daniel considered the question. "I think it stripped away a lot of things that didn't matter. Made me quieter, more careful with my words. Sarah was always the talker, the one who filled rooms with energy. Without her, I had to figure out who I was in the silence. And who are you? I'm still figuring that out." He looked at her. "But I think I'm someone who values the quiet now, someone who doesn't need noise to know he's alive." May smiled. "I think that's a good person to be." They were sitting closer than usual, shoulders almost touching, sharing warmth against the cold. Daniel was acutely aware of her presence, the way she wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, the way she tucked stray hair behind her ear, the way her breath made small clouds in the frigid air. "I've been thinking," May said suddenly, "about the ranch. Liang's ranch." She paused, correcting herself. "My ranch. I've been thinking I want to make it something different. Not erase what he built, but add to it. Make it mine too." "What did you have in mind?" "I'm not sure yet. But I know I can't keep it as a museum to his memory. That's not living. That's just existing in the past." She looked at him. "You said once that Sarah wanted you to buy your ranch, that it was her vision." "It was. Do you still run it the way she would have wanted?" Daniel thought about that. "No," he admitted. "I tried to at first, but I'm not Sarah. I don't have her ambitions or her energy. So I made it smaller, simpler, something I could manage on my own." Did that feel like betraying her? At first, yes, but then I realized she'd wanted me to have a life here, not to preserve her vision perfectly. She'd have understood that plans change, that people adapt. May nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "I think I need to give myself permission to do the same thing, to change things, to make mistakes." "You don't need permission," Daniel said. "It's your land, your life." "But it feels like I do, like I'm asking forgiveness from someone who can't grant it." "Then maybe you need to forgive yourself instead." The words hung in the cold air between them. May looked away, blinking hard, and Daniel gave her the space to compose herself. It was something he'd learned in their morning meetings, when to push and when to wait, when to speak, and when to simply be present. "I want to plant a garden," May said finally. "In the spring, vegetables, herbs, flowers, things that grow and change and live." She smiled slightly. "Liang always said the growing season was too short here, that it wasn't practical, but I don't care about practical anymore. I care about things that bloom. I'll help, Daniel offered. If you want, you would do that? Sure. I'm not much of a gardener, but I can dig holes and haul dirt with the best of them. May laughed, a sound that was becoming more common now. Then yes, I would like that very much. Over the following days, their routine expanded. They still met at dawn for coffee and conversation, but now Daniel found himself staying longer, helping with small tasks around May's ranch. A fence that needed mending, a door that hung crooked, a water trough that had cracked in the cold. He noticed things about her property that he hadn't seen from a distance. The careful way Liang had designed the barn for maximum efficiency. The Chinese characters carved into the doorframe of the house, protection symbols, May explained, meant to keep evil spirits away. The small altar in the corner of the main room, with Liang's photograph surrounded by offerings of fruit and incense. I know it seems strange to you, May said when she caught him looking at the altar, this tradition of honoring the dead. It doesn't seem strange, Daniel said, just different from what I know. In my culture, we believe the dead are still with us, still part of the family. We feed them, talk to them, include them in important decisions. She touched the photograph gently, but sometimes I wonder if I've included Liang so much that I've left no room for anyone else, even myself. What would he want, do you think, if he could tell you? May was quiet for a long moment. He'd want me to be happy, to stop punishing myself, to... She trailed off, then started again. Before he died, he used to say that I worried too much about what other people thought, that I should trust my own judgment more, be braver. She smiled sadly. I think he'd tell me to stop asking what he would want and start asking what I want. And what do you want? She looked at Daniel and something shifted in her expression. I want to stop being afraid. Of the future, of change, of... She broke off, shaking her head. Of many things. Daniel understood what she wasn't saying. He felt it too, this tentative thing growing between them, fragile as new ice and just as dangerous to test too soon. Fear makes sense, he said carefully, after what we've both been through. But it doesn't have to be the only thing we feel. No, May agreed. It doesn't. They stood in front of the altar, Liang's photograph watching them with eyes captured forever in a moment of joy, and Daniel felt the weight of the past pressing against the possibility of the future. It wasn't a comfortable feeling, but it was honest. That Sunday, what would have been another day of challenges and failures, May asked Daniel to help her with something. When he arrived at her ranch, she was standing by Haiyun's corral with a saddle in her arms. I want to try, she said simply, not to break him or prove anything, just to see if he'll let me close again. Are you sure? No. But I think that's the point, being unsure and doing it anyway. Daniel helped her carry the saddle to the fence. Haiyun watched from the center of the corral, alert but not agitated. May opened the gate slowly, and for a moment Daniel thought the horse might bolt. Instead, Haiyun held his ground. May entered the corral alone. Daniel stayed by the fence, ready to intervene if needed, but knowing this was something she had to do herself. She approached Haiyun slowly, speaking in soft Chinese. The stallion's ears swiveled toward her, tracking her movement. When she was 10 feet away, she stopped and simply stood there, the saddle still in her arms. I'm sorry, she said, and Daniel realized she was speaking English now, for his benefit, or maybe just because the words needed to be said aloud. I'm sorry I was angry with you. I'm sorry I let those men hurt you. I'm sorry I didn't understand that you were grieving too. Haiyun took a step toward her. May's breath caught, but she didn't move. The stallion took another step, then another, until he was close enough to smell the saddle, to see the tears on her face. Slowly, carefully, May set the saddle on the ground. Then she reached out one hand, palm up, offering nothing but presents. Haiyun stretched his neck forward and touched his muzzle to her palm. The sound May made was half sob, half laugh. She stood perfectly still while the horse breathed against her skin, relearning her scent, remembering. Then, moving as if through water, she raised her other hand and gently touched his neck. The stallion didn't pull away. Daniel watched as woman and horse stood together in the autumn sunlight, reconnecting across a chasm of loss. He thought about all the times he'd stood alone in his own grief, convinced he'd never feel whole again. He thought about Sarah's laugh, about Liang's dreams, about all the people who'd loved them and been loved in return. And he thought that maybe healing wasn't about fixing what was broken. Maybe it was about learning to hold the broken pieces gently, to honor what was lost while still making room for what might come next. May stayed in the corral for nearly an hour, just standing with He-Yun, touching him, speaking softly. She didn't try to saddle him or ride him. She simply reconnected, rebuilding trust one gentle moment at a time. When she finally emerged, her face was streaked with tears, but luminous with something that looked like hope. "He let me touch him," she said, as if Daniel might not have witnessed it. "After all this time, he let me back in." "He never really shut you out," Daniel said gently. "He just needed time to find his way back, same as you." May looked at him for a long moment, and in her eyes Daniel saw a question forming. But before she could ask it, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. A rider was approaching from the direction of town. Samuel Garrett, on his old gray gelding, moving faster than Daniel had seen him move in years. "Daniel! Mrs. May!" Samuel called out as he approached. "There's trouble in town? Patterson's boy got into it with some drifters at the saloon. Things got ugly. They're saying there might be a hanging." The words hit like cold water. Daniel and May exchanged a glance, and without discussion, both moved toward Daniel's barn where his horses were kept. "Tell us everything," Daniel said as he saddled his bay gelding with quick, efficient movements. "Patterson's boy, young Tom, the eldest, he caught 3 men trying to steal from his father's store," Samuel explained, his words tumbling out fast. "Called them out on it. They took exception. Ended up in a fight that spilled into the street. Tom's just a kid, barely 20, but he got some good hits in before they beat him down. Now those drifters are saying he pulled a knife first, that it was self-defense. They've got the sheriff convinced, and there's talk of stringing the boy up before anyone can sort out the truth." May had moved to the barn and was already leading out Liang's old mare, a steady sorrel that hadn't been ridden in months. She worked quickly, checking the saddle and bridle with practiced hands. "You're coming?" Daniel asked. "Tom Patterson is barely more than a child," May said, "and his mother lent me flour when I had none last winter. Of course I'm coming." Within minutes, all 3 of them were mounted and riding hard toward town. The cold air stung Daniel's face, and his mind raced ahead, trying to think of what they might face when they arrived. Thornfield wasn't a lawless town, but it wasn't civilized either. Justice here was often quick and brutal, and a scared sheriff could be swayed by a loud crowd. If those drifters had friends, if they'd managed to turn public opinion against young Tom. They rode through the valley as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, 3 riders racing against both distance and time. And Daniel couldn't help but think that this morning had started with hope and healing, with a woman reconnecting with her horse and tentative plans for a spring garden. Now they were riding toward violence and the threat of death, because that was the other truth about this valley, that beauty and brutality existed side by side, and you never knew which one would find you first. They smelled the smoke before they saw the town. Not the clean smoke of cook fires or hearths, but something thicker, angrier. The smell of a crowd working itself into fury. As they crested the final rise, Thornfield spread out below them in the fading light, and Daniel's stomach tightened at what he saw. The main street was packed with people, far more than should have been there on an ordinary Sunday evening. Torches flickered in the growing darkness, casting wild shadows against the buildings. And in the center of it all, just visible through the crowd, a young man stood with his hands bound, his face bloodied, while 3 hard-looking strangers argued loudly with Sheriff Coleman. "We need to get closer," Daniel said, spurring his horse forward. They rode straight down the middle of the street, and the crowd parted reluctantly to let them through. Daniel felt the weight of dozens of eyes on them, curious, hostile, uncertain. Beside him, May sat straight in her saddle, her face composed despite the tension radiating from her shoulders. On his other side, Samuel kept up a steady stream of greetings to people he knew, using familiarity as a weapon against mob mentality. Sheriff Coleman looked relieved when he saw them approaching. He was a decent man, Daniel knew, but not a strong one. The kind of lawman who could handle Saturday night drunks but wilted in the face of real trouble. "Daniel, Samuel." Coleman's eyes flicked to May, and Daniel saw him struggle with how to address her. "Ma'am, glad you're here. This situation's getting out of hand." "What happened?" Daniel dismounted, keeping his voice calm and level. The worst thing you could do with an angry crowd was add more anger to the mix. One of the drifters stepped forward before Coleman could answer. He was tall and rangy, with a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his jaw, and eyes that had seen too much violence to be fazed by more. What happened is this little bastard tried to kill us. We were minding our own business in the saloon when he came at us with a knife, calling us thieves. We defended ourselves, nothing more. That's a lie. The shout came from young Tom Patterson, his voice cracking with desperation. Blood ran from a cut above his eye, and his right arm hung at an odd angle. I saw them coming out of my father's store through the back door. They had our goods in their hands, tobacco, ammunition, cash from the strongbox. I confronted them and they attacked me. I never drew a knife until one of them pulled one first. The boy's lying to save his own skin, another drifter said. This one was shorter, with a cruel twist to his mouth. We got witnesses who'll say different. Basim. What witnesses? Samuel demanded. Who saw what happened? A few men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Daniel noticed that most of the faces he recognized, the respectable townspeople, the ranchers and merchants, were hanging back, while the front of the crowd was filled with drifters, gamblers, and the kind of men who appeared when trouble was brewing and disappeared when honest work needed doing. The boy started it, the scarred drifter said again, and in a fair fight, a man's got a right to defend himself. Now, the way I see it, attempted murder's a hanging offense, and justice should be swift. A murmur of agreement rippled through parts of the crowd. Daniel felt the situation tilting toward violence, momentum building like water behind a dam. Hold on! Daniel's voice cut through the noise, quiet but carrying. Nobody's hanging anybody until we've sorted out the facts. And who the hell are you? The scarred man demanded. Daniel Cross. I ranch north of here, and I'm saying we take a breath and think this through. We don't need some rancher telling us how to handle town business, the shorter drifter said. But there was calculation in his eyes now. He was measuring Daniel, trying to decide if he was a threat. Maybe not, Daniel agreed. But you also don't need a lynch mob when there's a sheriff standing right here with a jail that works just fine for holding prisoners until a proper trial can be arranged. A trial could take weeks, someone in the crowd called out. We can't have criminals just sitting around eating our food and wasting our time. Better than hanging an innocent boy, May said. Her voice was clear and strong, and the unexpectedness of a Chinese woman speaking up in the middle of a mob caused a momentary silence. The scarred drifter's eyes narrowed. This ain't your concern, woman. Why don't you go back to wherever you came from and let the real Americans handle this? The words hung in the air like poison. Daniel felt rage flash through him, hot and sudden, but before he could respond, May spoke again. I am as much a part of this valley as anyone here, she said calmly, and I will not stand silent while you murder a boy to cover your own crimes. You calling us criminals? The third drifter spoke for the first time, moving forward with his hand near the gun on his hip. Because them's fighting words. The crowd tensed. Daniel saw Sheriff Coleman's hand drift toward his own weapon, saw Samuel step slightly in front of May, saw young Tom Patterson's eyes go wide with fear that violence was about to spread beyond him, and then a new voice cut through the tension. That's enough! Everyone turned. A woman was pushing through the crowd, Mrs. Patterson, Tom's mother. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she moved with the authority of someone who'd raised 5 children and wasn't about to be intimidated by a pack of drifters. My boy is no liar, she said, her voice shaking but fierce. And I won't see him hanged based on the word of strangers who can't even look me in the eye when they speak. Ma'am, I understand you're upset, the shorter drifter began. Don't you ma'am me, Mrs. Patterson snapped. I've lived in this town for 23 years. I know every person here. And I know for a fact that my husband locked that strongbox himself this morning and put the key in his pocket. So either you broke in and stole it, or you're lying about having witnesses. The drifters exchanged glances. Daniel saw the scarred one's jaw tighten, saw the way his hand flexed near his gun. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge. Check their saddlebags, Daniel said quietly to Sheriff Coleman. If they're innocent, they won't mind proving it. Coleman looked torn. I can't just search a man's property without cause. The cause is standing right there with blood on his face, May said, pointing at Tom. And the evidence is in those bags. Unless these men have something to hide. The scarred drifter took a step toward May, his face twisted with rage. You've got a smart mouth for a... He never finished the sentence. Daniel moved between them, his body language relaxed, but his eyes hard as stone. You'll want to think real careful about your next words. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Daniel could feel the violence radiating off the drifter like heat from a fire, but he'd faced down angry men before, and he knew the key was to stay calm, to not give them an excuse to escalate. Finally, the drifter stepped back. Fine, check the bags, you won't find nothing. But his eyes said otherwise. Sheriff Coleman moved toward the horses tied at the saloon rail, and the crowd shifted to watch. Daniel noticed that more townspeople had pushed forward now, emboldened by Mrs. Patterson's stand, and curious to see what would be found. The first saddlebag yielded nothing unusual. The second contained whiskey and dried meat. But when Coleman opened the third bag, he pulled out a tobacco tin that Mrs. Patterson immediately identified as coming from her husband's store. That's ours, she said firmly. Has my husband's mark on the bottom. See there? The 3 notches he always makes. The crowd's mood shifted immediately. Angry mutters turned toward the drifters now, and Daniel saw several men who'd been calling for Tom's hanging suddenly develop intense interest in their boots. This doesn't prove anything, the scarred drifter said, but his voice had lost its confidence. Could have bought that tobacco earlier. From a locked store on a Sunday? Samuel said dryly. That's some impressive shopping. Sheriff Coleman pulled out more items, ammunition boxes, a small leather pouch that clinked with coins, each one Mrs. Patterson identified as belonging to the store. I think, Coleman said, his voice stronger now that the evidence was on his side, we need to have a longer conversation about what happened today. You 3 gentlemen will be spending the night in jail while I sort this out. And Tom, he turned to the young man, you'll need to give a full statement, but you're free to go home with your mother. The drifters protested loudly, but the crowd was against them now. Several large ranchers Daniel recognized stepped forward to help Coleman escort the men to the jail, and the mob that had been calling for blood 5 minutes ago suddenly became a gathering of concerned citizens discussing what a close call it had been. Daniel watched it all with a mixture of relief and disgust. This was how justice worked out here, not based on truth or evidence, but on momentum, and whoever could sway the crowd's emotions. Today they'd gotten lucky. Tomorrow might be different. Mrs. Patterson approached them as the crowd began to disperse, her son leaning heavily on her shoulder. Up close, Daniel could see Tom was younger than he'd thought, 19 at most, with a boy's thin frame and eyes that had just learned how quickly life could turn deadly. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson said, looking at each of them in turn. All of you, if you hadn't come... She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Tom, May said gently, you should see a doctor about that arm. The boy nodded, wincing. Yes, ma'am. My mother's already planning to drag me there. Good. May's expression softened. You were very brave today. Foolish, perhaps, to confront 3 armed men alone. But brave. Tom managed a weak smile. My father always said our name meant something in this town, that we stand up for what's right. He looked down. Though I guess today I learned there's a difference between standing up and being stupid. No, Daniel said. You did the right thing. You just needed help doing it, that's all. Nothing wrong with that. After the Pattersons left, Daniel, May, and Samuel stood in the now quiet street. Torches still burned in sconces along the buildings, casting pools of warm light in the gathering darkness. The saloon had reopened and piano music drifted out along with laughter and the clink of glasses. Life returning to normal, as if the near hanging had been nothing more than an evening's entertainment. This town, Samuel said, shaking his head. Some days I wonder why I stay. Because it's home, May said quietly. Even when it's terrible, even when it disappoints us. It's still home. Samuel looked at her with something like surprise. That's more grace than most folks would show after the way they've treated you. Grace has nothing to do with it, May replied. I'm just too tired to keep being angry. They walked their horses toward the livery stable where they could leave them for the night. The ride back to their ranches in the dark would be dangerous, and Daniel had already decided they should stay in town until morning. As they walked, they passed the general store where the attempted robbery had started the whole mess. The back door hung open, splintered where the drifters had forced it. Through the doorway, Daniel could see Mr. Patterson inside, taking inventory of what had been stolen and what remained. "Daniel, Mrs. May." Patterson came to the door, a ledger in his hands. "Heard what you did. Can't thank you enough." "Your wife and son did the real work," Daniel said. "We just added our voices to theirs." Patterson shook his head. "You stood up when it mattered. That counts for something." He looked at May. "And I apologize, ma'am, for what that drifter said to you. Weren't right, weren't Christian, and I'm sorry you had to hear it." May nodded, accepting the apology with quiet dignity. The words of frightened, angry men don't wound as deep as they once did. After they'd settled the horses and arranged rooms at the boarding house, the town's only accommodation for travelers, Daniel found himself on the boarding house porch, looking out at Thornfield's quiet streets. The crisis had passed, but the adrenaline hadn't fully left his system yet. He felt restless, unable to settle. May joined him a few minutes later, wrapped in a shawl against the cold. They stood side by side in comfortable silence, watching the last few townspeople make their way home. "I keep thinking about what might have happened if we hadn't come," May said finally. "If Samuel hadn't ridden out to warn us." "Best not to think about it," Daniel said. "We did come. That's what matters." "But it's not enough, is it? Coming once, helping once? Tomorrow there'll be another Tom Patterson, another mob, another moment when things could go either way." She turned to look at him. "How do you live with that? Knowing you can't fix everything?" Daniel thought about Sarah, about all the times he'd tried to shield her from the harshness of frontier life and failed, about how she'd died despite his best efforts, despite prayers and doctors and sheer desperate hope. "You can't fix everything," he said quietly, "but you can show up. You can stand up when it matters. And you can hope that enough people doing the same thing create something that looks like civilization instead of chaos. That's a lot of hope to carry." "It's the only thing worth carrying." May smiled at that, a small, sad smile that acknowledged both the truth and the weight of it. "You're an optimist, Daniel Cross. I wouldn't have guessed that when I first met you." "I'm not an optimist. I'm just stubborn. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Optimists think things will get better. Stubborn people just refuse to let them get worse without a fight." May laughed softly. "I think I'm stubborn too then, though I'm only just learning it." They stood quietly for a while longer. The night had grown cold enough that their breath made clouds in the air, and frost was already forming on the porch railings. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and another answered. "I should go in," May said finally. "It's late." "May," Daniel said as she turned to leave. She paused, looking back at him. "What you did tonight, speaking up like that, standing with us, that took courage. The kind that matters." "I was terrified," she admitted. "When that man stepped toward me, I thought—" She shook her head. "But then I saw your face, and I knew you wouldn't let anything happen to me. And that made me braver than I actually am." "You're braver than you think," Daniel said. "You've been brave since the day your husband died. You just haven't given yourself credit for it." May's eyes glistened in the lamplight. "Thank you for that. For seeing me that way." She paused. "For seeing me at all." Before he could respond, she'd slipped inside, leaving Daniel alone on the porch with the cold and the stars and the echo of words that felt like they meant more than they'd said. The next morning broke clear and cold, the sun turning the frost-covered town into something magical and temporary. Daniel woke early and found Samuel already in the boarding house dining room, working his way through a plate of eggs and bacon. "Sleep well?" Samuel asked. "Well enough." Daniel poured himself coffee from the pot on the table. "You heading back to town or coming with us?" "I'll stick around a bit. Want to make sure Coleman actually files charges against those drifters and doesn't let them slip away when nobody's watching." Samuel chewed thoughtfully. "Besides, I'm curious to see if this changes anything." "Changes what?" "The way folks treat Mrs. May. She spoke up for one of their own last night, stood tall when others were ready to watch a boy hang. That kind of thing has a way of shifting perspectives." Daniel hadn't thought about it that way, but Samuel was right. In a place like Thornfield, actions spoke louder than words, and respect had to be earned through deeds. May had earned some last night, whether she realized it or not. May appeared a few minutes later, looking tired but composed. She'd changed back into the dark cotton dress she'd worn riding yesterday, and her hair was braided in a single plait down her back. Without the red silk, without the armor of ritual, She looked younger and more vulnerable. They ate breakfast in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they finally stepped outside to collect their horses, they found a small crowd gathered in the street. Daniel's hand instinctively moved toward his hip, old reflexes kicking in, but then he realized these weren't angry townspeople. They were carrying baskets and parcels, and at the front of the group stood Mrs. Patterson. "Mrs. May," she said, stepping forward, "we wanted to thank you properly for what you did last night." She gestured to the others, and they came forward one by one, offering their gifts. A basket of fresh bread from the baker's wife, preserves and honey from the minister's widow, a length of good wool fabric from the seamstress, vegetables from the grocer. Each person mumbled their thanks, some more comfortably than others, but all genuine. May stood frozen, clearly overwhelmed. Daniel watched her struggle to maintain her composure as the gifts piled up, as these people who'd largely ignored her for months suddenly acknowledged her humanity. "Thank you," she finally managed. This is very generous." "It's only right," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "You stood up for my boy when others wouldn't. That makes you family in my book." The word hung in the air, family. Daniel saw May's eyes fill with tears, saw her blink them back with effort. "I only did what anyone should do," May said quietly. "But you did it when others didn't," the baker's wife said. "That's what counts." The crowd dispersed slowly, and Daniel helped May pack the gifts into her saddlebags. There was far too much for one person to carry, so he redistributed some to his own horse and Samuel's. As they prepared to ride out, Sheriff Coleman appeared, looking like he hadn't slept much. "Wanted you to know those 3 men are locked up tight. I've sent word to the territorial marshal. There'll be a proper trial." "Good," Daniel said. "Tom Patterson deserves that much." "More than that," Coleman said. "The boy's a hero. Stopped a robbery, took a beating, and nearly got hanged for it. That kind of courage should be recognized." He looked at May. "Same goes for you, ma'am. What you said last night about being part of this valley, that took guts. And it was true. You are part of this valley, whether some folks have been too blind to see it or not." May nodded, unable to speak. Coleman tipped his hat and walked away, leaving them standing in the street with horses loaded with unexpected kindness. They rode out of Thornfield in the growing warmth of the morning, the town behind them already returning to its normal rhythms. The crisis had passed, the danger was over, and life went on with the same indifferent momentum it always had. But something had shifted. Daniel felt it in the way May sat her horse, a little straighter, a little more certain. He saw it in the way she looked at the valley spreading out before them, as if seeing it fresh for the first time. "I never thought they'd accept me," she said as they rode. "I thought the best I could hope for was to be tolerated, left alone." "You gave them a reason to see you differently," Daniel said. "Sometimes that's all it takes." "Is it terrible that part of me resents needing their acceptance at all? That I had to prove myself worthy before they'd treat me with basic decency?" "No," Daniel said. "That's honest. And you're right, you shouldn't have had to prove anything. But this is the world we live in, not the world we wish we had." They rode in silence for a while, following the creek road home. The sun was warm on their backs, and the frost was melting into dew that made the grass sparkle like scattered diamonds. "Last night," May said suddenly, "when we were standing on the porch and you said I was brave, did you mean it? Every word. I've never thought of myself that way. Brave. I always thought I was just surviving, enduring, but you make it sound like that's the same thing as courage." "It is," Daniel said. "Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs doing anyway. You've been doing that since the day Liang died." May was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "When I first started the challenges with Hai Yun, I told myself it was about healing him, about giving him a chance to move past his grief. But really, I was testing everyone, testing to see if anyone understood what we'd lost, what it meant. And when they all failed, when they all treated it like a game, it confirmed what I already believed, that we were alone in our grief, that no one else could understand. And now? Now I think maybe I was wrong. Maybe grief isn't something that isolates us. Maybe it's something that can connect us if we let it." She looked at him. "You understood. From the very first day. You saw what I was doing and why, And you didn't judge me for it. I saw someone hurting, Daniel said simply. Same as I'd been hurting. Didn't take much wisdom to recognize that. But you didn't try to fix me. You didn't offer solutions or tell me to move on or any of the things people usually say. You just stayed. Every morning by the creek, just staying. Didn't know what else to do, Daniel admitted. But staying seemed better than leaving you alone. They'd reached the point where the road split, one path leading to Daniel's ranch and the other to May's. They pulled their horses to a stop, neither quite ready to separate yet. I need to tell you something, May said, and there was a tremor in her voice that made Daniel's chest tighten. Yesterday, before Samuel came, when I was in the corral with Haiyun, I realized something. I realized that I've been holding on to my grief so tightly because letting go felt like betraying Liang, like saying his death didn't matter, or that I didn't love him enough to stay broken forever. You don't have to let go, Daniel said gently. You just have to learn to carry it differently. That's what I realized. When Haiyun came to me, when he let me touch him again, I understood that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means making room for new things alongside the old. Love and loss, grief and hope, they can exist together. She met his eyes. You and Liang, the past and the future, they can exist together. The words settled between them, heavy with meaning. Daniel knew what she was saying, what she was offering. The question was whether he was ready to accept it. May, he said carefully, I care about you. These past weeks, talking with you, being around you, it's been the first time since Sarah died that I've felt like something other than a ghost going through the motions. But I don't want to rush this. I don't want to build something on top of grief that hasn't had time to settle. You deserve better than that. We both do. May smiled, and there was relief in it. I feel the same way. I'm not ready for whatever this might become, but I wanted you to know that I see it, the possibility of it, and that doesn't scare me the way it did before. Good, Daniel said, because it doesn't scare me either, not anymore. They sat on their horses at the crossroads, the morning sun warming their faces, and acknowledged what was growing between them without forcing it into a shape it wasn't ready to take. It was enough to know it existed, that it was there waiting whenever they were ready to tend it. I should get home, May said finally. Check on Haiyun, make sure he didn't decide the open gate yesterday was an invitation to leave after all. Want help unloading all those gifts? I would like that very much. They rode together to May's ranch, and Daniel helped her carry the baskets and parcels into the house. The interior was sparse but clean, with that mix of Chinese and American that spoke to two cultures learning to coexist. Liang's altar still held pride of place in the corner, but Daniel noticed that the offerings had changed. Instead of elaborate displays, there was now just a simple cup of tea and a single flower. I've been simplifying things, May explained when she caught him looking. Liang never cared for elaborate rituals anyway. He preferred quiet gestures, small kindnesses. Sounds like he was a good man. He was, not perfect. He could be stubborn, and he had a temper when things didn't go his way, but he was good, and he loved me even when I made it difficult. She smiled sadly. I wish you could have met him. I think you would have liked each other. I think so too. After they'd put everything away, they walked together to the corral. Haiyun stood at the far end, watching them approach with alert but calm eyes. When May spoke to him in Chinese, his ears pricked forward. I've been thinking about what to do next, May said. With him, with the ranch, with everything. And I think I need to start small, simple things. Rebuild trust one step at a time. Sounds wise. Would you teach me? The question came out in a rush. Not how to break him or train him like those men tried to do, but how to work with him. How to earn his trust back properly. You understand horses in a way I never learned. Liang always handled that part, and I just watched. Daniel considered the request. Teaching May to work with Haiyun would mean spending more time together, building something beyond their morning conversations. It would mean entering her space more fully, becoming part of her life in tangible ways. It would mean taking another step toward whatever this was becoming. I'd be honored, he said finally, but we go slow. Let him set the pace. No rushing, no forcing. That's exactly what I want. May looked at the stallion, and her expression was a mix of hope and determination. I want to do this right. For him and for me. Then we'll start tomorrow. Early before the heat of the day. Bring carrots or apples, whatever treats he used to like. We'll begin with just being near him, building association between your presence and good things. They spent the rest of the morning making plans, talking through approaches, discussing the small steps that would eventually lead to He-yun trusting May enough to be ridden again. It was good work, purposeful work, and Daniel felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Actual tangible hope for the future. When he finally rode home in the early afternoon, his mind was full of training strategies and timing considerations. But underneath all that practical thinking was a deeper awareness that his life was expanding again after 2 years of contraction, that he was building something new without tearing down what had been. Sarah would have liked May, he thought. She would have appreciated her quiet strength, her refusal to be diminished by loss, her determination to find her own path forward, and somehow, knowing that made everything feel a little more right. The next morning, Daniel arrived at May's ranch before dawn, carrying a bucket of apple slices and a coil of soft rope. May was already awake, waiting on her porch with coffee and a nervousness that showed in the way she kept smoothing her skirt. "Ready?" Daniel asked. "No, but I'm going to do it anyway." They approached the corral together, moving slowly and talking quietly. He-yun watched them come, and Daniel studied the horse's body language. Ears forward, weight balanced, no tension in his stance. Good signs. "First thing is to just let him see us," Daniel said. "We're not asking anything yet. We're just being present." They stood at the fence for 10 minutes, doing nothing but existing in the horse's space. May shifted restlessly, clearly wanting to do more, but Daniel touched her arm gently and shook his head. Patience was the first lesson, for both woman and horse. Finally, He-yun took a step toward them. Then another. Slowly, with the caution of a creature who'd learned that humans could cause pain, he approached the fence. "Now," Daniel said quietly, "offer him an apple slice. Palm flat, fingers together. Let him choose whether to take it." May's hand trembled slightly as she held out the apple. He-yun stretched his neck forward, nostrils flaring, testing the scent. For a moment Daniel thought he might refuse, but then the stallion's lips delicately plucked the apple from May's palm. The sound she made was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. He remembered that I used to bring him apples." "Animals don't forget," Daniel said. "They just need to be reminded that remembering is safe." They stayed at the fence for another hour, offering treats and soft words, letting He-yun decide when to approach and when to retreat. By the time the sun was fully up, the stallion was standing close enough for May to touch his neck, though she didn't yet. She was learning the rhythm of this dance, understanding that pressure and release, approach and retreat were all part of rebuilding trust. "That's enough for today," Daniel said finally. "We don't want to push too hard too fast." May nodded, reluctantly stepping back from the fence. "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," Daniel agreed. "Same time." And so it began, a new ritual to replace the old one. Every morning, Daniel and May met at the corral and worked with He-yun. Some days the horse was receptive, approaching easily and accepting treats. Other days he was skittish, staying at the far end of the corral and only watching from a distance. Daniel taught May to read those moods, to respect them, to understand that healing wasn't linear. They talked while they worked, their conversations weaving through past and present, loss and possibility. May told stories about her childhood in China, about crossing the ocean with nothing but hope and desperation, about building a life in a language she'd had to learn one painful word at a time. Daniel shared memories of Sarah that he hadn't spoken aloud in years, finding that they hurt less when given voice, that grief grew lighter when shared. The valley moved around them through its seasonal changes. The frost grew heavier, ice formed thicker on the creek, and the first real snow fell in fat, lazy flakes that turned the world white and quiet. Through it all, they kept working, with the horse, with themselves, with the careful construction of something that looked more and more like a future. And slowly, He-yun began to heal. The wild fear in his eyes softened. The aggressive defense of his space became calm acceptance. And the wall between him and May grew thin enough that one cold morning, when she entered the corral alone, He walked straight to her and rested his head on her shoulder. Daniel watched from outside the fence as woman and horse stood together in the winter sunlight, connected again by invisible threads of trust and memory and love that didn't end with death. And he thought that maybe that was the real miracle. Not that they'd survived their losses, but that they'd found ways to carry them forward without being crushed by the weight. The morning May decided to try riding Hae-Yun again. The valley was wrapped in fog so thick Daniel could barely see 10 feet in front of him. He'd woken with an uneasy feeling, though he couldn't name its source. And when he arrived at the creek for their usual meeting, May wasn't there. He found her at the corral instead, standing with a saddle at her feet and determination written across her face. Hae-Yun stood nearby, calm but watchful, as if he understood that something significant was about to happen. "I'm ready," May said when she heard Daniel approach. "Or at least, I need to try." Daniel looked at the horse, then at her, weighing the moment. They'd been working together for nearly 3 months now. Winter had fully settled into the valley, and in that time, Hae-Yun had transformed from a grief-mad stallion into something approaching his old self. He let May groom him, feed him, walk beside him. But riding was different. Riding required a level of trust that went beyond simple proximity. "You sure about this?" Daniel asked. "No, but I've learned that being sure isn't a requirement for doing what needs to be done." She picked up the saddle, testing its weight. "Will you help me?" They entered the corral together, moving with the slow deliberation that had become their practice. Hae-Yun's ears swiveled toward them, tracking their movement, but he didn't retreat. May approached him first, speaking softly in Chinese, and the stallion lowered his head to nuzzle her shoulder, a gesture that still made Daniel's throat tight every time he witnessed it. "We'll start with just the saddle blanket," Daniel said. "Let him remember what it feels like. No rush." May draped the blanket across Hae-Yun's back, smoothing it with gentle hands. The horse tensed slightly, muscles quivering beneath the wool, but he held still. She praised him, offered an apple slice, let him stand with the weight for several minutes before carefully removing it. They repeated the process 3 times, adding the saddle on the final attempt. Hae-Yun shifted uneasily when the leather settled onto his back, and for a moment Daniel thought he might bolt. But May kept talking, her voice low and steady, and gradually the stallion relaxed. "Good," Daniel murmured. "That's real good. Now we wait." They stood in the fog-shrouded corral for nearly half an hour, letting Hae-Yun adjust to the saddle's presence. Daniel watched May's face during that time, saw the play of emotions there: fear, hope, grief, determination. She was beautiful in her complexity, he thought, in the way she contained multitudes without trying to hide them. "I think I'm going to try mounting him," May said finally. "Just sitting," Daniel cautioned. "Don't ask him to move yet. Just sit and let him feel your weight." May nodded, her jaw set. She moved to Hae-Yun's side, placed her foot in the stirrup, and paused. Daniel saw her hands trembling on the saddle horn. "You don't have to do this today," he said gently. "Yes, I do." She took a breath. "The longer I wait, the more afraid I'll become, and I'm tired of being afraid." In one smooth motion, she swung herself up and settled into the saddle. Hae-Yun's entire body went rigid. His ears pinned back, and Daniel saw the whites of his eyes show, the first sign of real panic they'd seen in weeks. "Easy," May whispered, leaning forward to stroke the stallion's neck. "Easy, Hae-Yun. It's just me. Just me." The horse stood frozen, every muscle coiled tight. Daniel held his breath, ready to intervene if needed, but giving May space to handle this herself. This was her moment, her risk to take. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Hae-Yun's ears came forward. His breathing steadied. The tension in his body began to ease. "That's it," May breathed. "That's my good boy. I'm not going to hurt you. We're not going to hurt each other." She sat perfectly still, letting the horse adjust to her presence above him, and Daniel watched something profound happen in the space between woman and animal. It wasn't dominance, it wasn't submission, it was mutual recognition. 2 creatures who'd both lost someone they loved, both spent months locked in grief, finally acknowledging that they could carry each other forward. After 5 minutes, May carefully dismounted. Her legs were shaking when her feet hit the ground, and there were tears on her face, but she was smiling. "He let me," she said, her voice breaking. He actually let me. You did it together, Daniel said. That's what matters. May turned to Hayun and wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her face against his warm coat. The stallion stood quiet, accepting her embrace with the patience of the forgiven, and Daniel felt something shift in his own chest, a door opening that he'd thought was locked forever. They walked back to May's house together, the fog beginning to lift as the sun climbed higher. Inside, May put on water for tea while Daniel added wood to the stove. The domestic simplicity of it struck him, how natural it felt to move through her space, to know where she kept the cups, and how she liked her tea prepared. I've been thinking, May said as they settled at her small kitchen table, about next steps. With the ranch, with everything. What kind of thinking? The kind that involves change. She wrapped her hands around her cup, gathering her thoughts. This place? It's Liang's dream, Liang's vision. Every fence post, every building, everything was built according to his plans. And I've been trying to honor that by keeping it exactly as he left it. But I'm realizing that's not honoring him. That's embalming him. Daniel nodded slowly. What would you change? The garden, definitely, but also the house. I want to paint the walls, rearrange the furniture, make it feel like mine instead of like a museum. She looked around the sparse room. And I want to add things. Beautiful things. Not because they're practical or necessary, but because they bring me joy. Like what? Books. I had a collection in San Francisco. Poetry, novels, philosophy. I sold most of them when we moved here because Liang said we needed to prioritize practical supplies. But I miss them. I miss having words around me that weren't about survival. She smiled slightly. And curtains. Good ones. With color. Liang always said curtains were a waste of money, that functional was better than decorative. But I want beautiful curtains that make me happy every time I look at them. Daniel thought about his own house, still arranged exactly as Sarah had left it. Her sewing basket still sat in the corner, her apron still hung by the door. He'd been living in a shrine for 2 years, afraid that changing anything would mean erasing her. I think that's wise, he said quietly, making the space yours. Sarah used to say that a house should grow with the people in it, that keeping it static was like trying to hold your breath forever. She sounds like she was a smart woman. She was. Still is in my memory, just different now. Softer around the edges, I guess. Less like a person and more like a feeling. May reached across the table and took his hand. It was the first time she'd initiated that kind of contact, and the touch sent warmth through Daniel's entire body. I'm scared, she admitted, of changing things, of moving forward, of what it means to let go of the grief that's been keeping me company all these months. Grief's a terrible companion, Daniel said, but at least it's familiar. Exactly, and the future is unknown, uncertain. What if I'm not strong enough to build something new? What if I try and fail? Then you fail, and you try again. That's how everything worth doing gets done. They sat in silence for a while, hands clasped across the table, drawing strength from each other's presence. Outside, the fog had fully lifted, revealing a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Daniel, May said finally, when you look at me, what do you see? The question caught him off guard. He studied her face, the delicate bone structure, the dark eyes that held oceans of experience, the mouth that could shift from sorrow to joy in a heartbeat. I see someone who's survived something that would have broken most people, he said honestly. I see strength and grace and a stubborn refusal to let circumstances define you. I see someone who's learning to live again, even though it's terrifying. He paused. And I see someone I care about more than I probably should, given how recent all our losses are. May's breath caught. You care about me? You know I do. We've been dancing around it for weeks now. I know, but hearing you say it out loud is different. She tightened her grip on his hand. I care about you too. And that terrifies me because the last person I cared about died, and I don't know if I could survive that kind of loss again. Neither do I, Daniel admitted, but I'm tired of living like I'm already dead. Tired of treating every day like it's just something to get through instead of something to experience. So what do? We take it slow. We keep meeting at the creek. We keep working with Hayun. We keep being honest with each other. He looked at their joined hands, and we see where that leads without forcing it to be more than it is. That sounds manageable, May smiled, though her eyes were wet. Terrifying, but manageable. They spent the rest of the morning together talking about practical things, the garden plans for spring, repairs the barn needed, whether to increase the size of May's small cattle herd. But underneath the practical ran a current of something deeper, an acknowledgement that they were building toward a shared future even if they weren't ready to name it yet. When Daniel finally left to tend his own ranch, he felt lighter than he had in months. The fog had burned off completely, leaving the valley crystalline and bright, and he rode home with something that felt dangerously close to happiness warming his chest. But happiness, he'd learned, was a fragile thing in this valley, and the universe had a way of testing it just when you started to trust it. The trouble started 3 days later, announced by hoofbeats and shouting that echoed across the valley in the early morning. Daniel was at May's ranch. They'd been working on reinforcing the corral fence, when a rider appeared on the horizon, coming fast. It was young Tom Patterson, and the fear on his face was visible even from a distance. "Mr. Cross, Mrs. May," he shouted as he approached. "You need to come quick. There's been an accident at the mine." Daniel's blood went cold. The Thornfield silver mine was small and poorly run, but it employed a dozen men from the valley, including several he knew. "What kind of accident?" "Collapse. Part of the main shaft came down about an hour ago. They think there are men trapped inside." Tom's voice cracked. "My father's in there. He went down this morning to inspect the supports." May was already moving toward her horse. "How many trapped?" "They don't know. Maybe 5, maybe more. Sheriff Coleman's organizing a rescue, but they need every able body they can get." Daniel and May exchanged a glance, years of understanding passing between them in a second. Then they were both mounting up, following Tom back toward town at a pace that was just short of reckless. The scene at the mine was chaos. The small structure that housed the mine entrance was surrounded by people, workers, wives, children, townspeople who'd come to help or simply to bear witness. Sheriff Coleman was trying to organize teams, but panic was making everyone talk over each other. "Daniel, thank heaven." Coleman grabbed his arm as soon as he dismounted. "We need men who can think clearly and won't fall apart underground." "You ever done mine work?" "Some, back in Missouri." "Good enough. We've got a secondary shaft that's still stable. We're sending teams down to try to reach the trapped men from below, but the air's bad and the supports are questionable. It's dangerous work." "I'll go," Daniel said without hesitation. "Me too." The voice came from behind him. Daniel turned to find May standing there, her face set with determination. "Ma'am, with respect, this isn't," Coleman began. "I'm small, which means I can fit through spaces your larger men can't," May interrupted. "And I have steady hands. If there are injured men down there, you'll need someone who won't panic at the sight of blood." Coleman looked like he wanted to argue, but Tom Patterson's mother stepped forward. "She's right, Sheriff, and we need every person we can get. My husband's down there." "Fine," Coleman said, though he didn't look happy about it. "But you follow orders exactly, understand? One wrong move down there and we'll have more bodies to dig out." They were given oil lamps, rope, and basic digging tools. The rescue team consisted of 8 people: Daniel, May, 2 experienced miners named Jack and Henry, and 4 other volunteers. As they prepared to descend into the secondary shaft, Daniel caught May's eye. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "Yes, I do. These are our people. Our valley." She adjusted her lamp. "Besides, you're going down there, and I'm not letting you do it alone." The secondary shaft was narrow and steep, descending at a sharp angle into darkness. Daniel went first, testing each handhold and foothold before putting his weight on it. Behind him, he could hear May's steady breathing and the cautious movements of the others. The air grew thicker as they descended, heavy with dust and the smell of disturbed earth. Daniel's lamp threw wild shadows on the rough stone walls, and every few feet he had to stop and assess the stability of the shaft. "How far down?" May called up from behind him. "Maybe 60 feet so far," Daniel replied. "We should be getting close to the main tunnel." A voice echoed up from below, Jack, who'd gone ahead to scout. "Found it. The main tunnel's partially blocked, but there's a gap we might be able to squeeze through." When they reached the junction point, Daniel saw what Jack meant. A wall of fallen rock and timber blocked most of the main tunnel, but there was a gap near the ceiling, maybe 2 feet wide. Not big enough for most men to fit through comfortably, but possibly big enough for May. I'll go, she said before anyone could suggest it. It's too dangerous, Daniel protested. We don't know what's on the other side, how stable the rock is. Which is exactly why someone needs to look. May was already removing her heavy coat. Tie a rope around my waist. If anything starts to collapse, pull me back. Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to forbid it, wanted to do anything except let her crawl into that narrow gap. But he saw the determination in her face and knew she was right. She was the smallest person there, the most likely to fit through. With hands that shook slightly, he tied the rope around her waist, testing the knot 3 times to make sure it would hold. You feel anything shift, anything at all, you come back immediately. Promise me. I promise. She touched his face briefly, a gesture so tender it made his chest ache. I'll be careful. Then she was climbing up toward the gap, lamp in one hand, moving with a grace that came from years of making herself small to survive in a world that didn't want to make room for her. Daniel watched her disappear into the darkness, feeding rope through his hands and counting the seconds. Mrs. May? Jack called. You through yet? Her voice came back muffled and distant. Almost. There's another section of... She broke off. Wait, I hear something. Everyone froze. In the silence, Daniel could hear it too, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, someone signaling from deeper in the mine. They're alive, May's voice came back, stronger now. I can hear them tapping. They're... Oh no. What is it? Daniel demanded. There's water, a lot of water. The collapse must have broken into an underground spring. It's filling the tunnel where they're trapped. The implications hit everyone at once. If water was filling the tunnel, the trapped men didn't just need rescue. They needed it fast before they drowned in the darkness. Can you see them? Coleman called up. Not yet, but the tapping is getting louder. I'm going to try to get closer. May, no. Daniel started, but she was already moving deeper into the gap. He stood there with the rope in his hands, feeling more helpless than he'd ever felt in his life. Every instinct screamed at him to pull her back, to not let her risk herself for men who might already be lost. But he knew her well enough now to know that wasn't who she was. She'd spent months learning to be brave again, and he couldn't take that away from her by treating her like she was fragile. I see them, May's voice echoed back. 5 men, trapped behind another rockfall. The water's up to their waists and rising. We need to widen this gap. I'm too small to help them through, and they can't break through from their side. Jack and Henry immediately began attacking the gap with picks and crowbars, widening it inch by careful inch. Every strike sent dust and small rocks cascading down, and Daniel held his breath each time, terrified that the whole thing would collapse and bury May alive. How much time do we have? Coleman shouted. Not much, May called back. Maybe an hour before the water reaches the ceiling, less if the flow increases. They worked frantically, the sounds of their labor echoing through the tunnels. Daniel wanted to be up there helping widen the gap, but someone needed to hold May's rope, to be ready to pull her back if anything went wrong. So he stood his ground, hands cramping around the rough hemp, and prayed to whatever forces might be listening that she would be okay. After what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes, Jack called out, It's wide enough, sending Daniel through. Wait, Daniel said. I've got her rope, Henry said, taking it from him. You're the next smallest after her, and you've got the strength to help pull men through. Go. Daniel climbed up to the gap, which was now maybe 3 feet wide. He squeezed through, scraping his shoulders against rough stone, and emerged on the other side to find May kneeling at the edge of a pool of dark water, her lamp held high. In the water, 5 men clung to jutting rocks and timber, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion. Daniel recognized Mr. Patterson immediately, also 2 other men from town, and 2 miners he didn't know. Daniel! Patterson's voice was hoarse. Thank heaven. We thought, when the water started rising, we thought nobody would reach us in time. We're getting you out, Daniel said. 1 at a time. Who's strongest? Bill here, Patterson gestured to one of the miners. He's been holding young Marcus up. The boy took a bad hit when the ceiling came down. Daniel assessed the situation quickly. The water was indeed rising. He could see it lapping higher against the rocks even in the few seconds he'd been there. And beyond the trapped men, the tunnel disappeared into darkness, completely flooded. Bill, You come first, Daniel called. We'll get you through, then send you back with rope for the others. Working together, Daniel and May helped Bill navigate through the water to their side. The big miner was exhausted, his movements clumsy, but he made it to the narrow gap and was pulled through by the men on the other side. One by one, they evacuated the trapped miners. Each extraction took precious minutes, and all the while the water kept rising. By the time they pulled Marcus through, the young man semi-conscious and bleeding from a head wound, the water was lapping at Daniel's knees. "Just you and me now," Daniel said to Patterson. "You go next." "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you. Go." Patterson didn't argue, too exhausted to do anything but obey. Daniel helped him into the water, supporting his weight as they waded toward the gap. Behind them, May held her lamp high, providing light. They'd just gotten Patterson to the gap when Daniel heard it. A deep groaning sound from somewhere in the flooded tunnel, followed by a crash that sent water surging toward them in a wave. "Go! Go!" Daniel shouted, practically throwing Patterson at the gap. Hands reached through and hauled the older man to safety. "Daniel, come on!" May grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the gap. But as they moved, he saw the water surge again, and this time it was carrying debris, rocks, timber, the detritus of a mine eating itself. "May, climb! Now!" He lifted her bodily toward the gap, and she scrambled through just as another wave hit. Daniel tried to follow, but something caught his leg, a piece of timber, wedged between rocks and now tangled around his calf. He pulled hard, but it wouldn't budge, and the water was rising fast now, up to his chest, and he could hear more groaning from deeper in the mine. "Daniel!" May's face appeared in the gap, her hand reaching for him. "What's wrong?" "I'm caught. Something's got my leg." "Can you free it?" He tried again, yanking hard enough to send pain shooting through his knee. "No, it's wedged tight." On the other side of the gap, he could hear shouting, arguments about what to do. Someone suggested coming back through to help, but Daniel knew there wasn't time. The water was at his shoulders now, and his lamp was sputtering in the spray. "You need to go," he called to May. "Get back! Get safe!" "Absolutely not." Her voice was fierce. "I'm not leaving you." "May—" "Rope! Throw me rope!" she shouted to the men on the other side. A coil came sailing through the gap, and she caught it with practiced ease. "I'm coming back through." "Don't you dare!" Daniel started, but she was already sliding through the gap, rope tied around her waist, moving with desperate speed. She hit the water beside him with a splash, immediately diving under. Daniel felt her hands on his trapped leg, felt her pulling at the timber. The water was at his chin now, and he had to tilt his head back to breathe. "May, there's no time." She surfaced, gasping. "There's a crossbeam. If I can shift it." She dove again. Daniel felt the timber move slightly, then a bit more. He pulled with everything he had, muscles screaming, and suddenly his leg came free. The momentum sent him backwards into the water, and for a disorienting moment he couldn't tell which way was up. Then May's hand found his, pulling him toward the surface. They broke through together, both gasping, and Daniel heard the loudest groan yet from somewhere in the darkness. "The tunnel's collapsing," he shouted over the roar of water. "We have to move now." They half swam, half waded toward the gap, fighting against the current. Daniel boosted May up first, watching her scramble through, then grabbed the rope that was thrown back to him. He pulled himself up just as a massive section of ceiling gave way behind them, sending a wall of water and debris rushing through the space where they'd been standing seconds before. Hands grabbed him, pulled him through, and suddenly he was on the other side, coughing up mine water and dust, but alive. Beside him, May was doing the same, her face smudged with dirt and her hair plastered to her head. "You came back," he said when he could speak. "You should have run." "And missed the chance to save you?" She was crying and laughing at the same time. "Not likely, Daniel Cross." The climb back to the surface seemed to take forever. Daniel's injured leg throbbed with every step, and he could feel exhaustion trying to pull him down. But May stayed close, supporting him when he stumbled, encouraging him when he wanted to stop and rest. When they finally emerged into daylight, the crowd erupted in cheers. People rushed forward, wives reuniting with husbands, children finding fathers, the community coming together in the relief of disaster averted. Mrs. Patterson reached them first, pulling May into a fierce hug that left them both in tears. "You saved them. You saved my husband." "We all saved them," May said, but her words were lost in the celebration. Daniel found himself surrounded by people thanking him, clapping his shoulder, offering congratulations he didn't feel he deserved. All he could think about was the moment when May had come back through that gap, had chosen to risk drowning rather than leave him behind. Finally, the crowd dispersed enough that he could reach her. She was sitting on a wagon tailgate being tended by the town doctor who was checking her for injuries. When she saw Daniel approaching, she stood up despite the doctor's protests. They came together without words, and Daniel wrapped his arms around her, holding on like she was the only solid thing in a world that kept trying to shake itself apart. She held him just as tightly, her face pressed against his chest, and he felt her tears soak through his shirt. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. "When you said you were caught, I thought, I know. I thought the same thing when you went through that gap the first time." He pulled back enough to look at her face. "You were magnificent down there, brave and strong and everything I admire about you." "I was terrified," she admitted. "Every second I was terrified. That's what made it brave." They stood there in the afternoon sun, covered in mine dirt and exhaustion, while around them the valley celebrated survival. And Daniel realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful distance they'd been maintaining, the slow approach, the fear of moving too fast, all of it had been burned away in the darkness underground. "May," he said quietly, "I love you. I think I've loved you for a while now, but I was too afraid to say it. But life's too short and too uncertain to not say the things that matter." She looked up at him with eyes that held the whole sky. "I love you too. And you're right. We should say it. We should say everything that matters while we still can." He kissed her then, right there in front of the whole town, and didn't care who saw or what they thought, because he'd spent 2 years being careful, being cautious, protecting himself from more loss, and it had gotten him exactly nowhere except lonely. When they finally pulled apart, Samuel Garrett was standing nearby with a knowing smile on his weathered face. "About damn time," the old man said. "Thought you two were going to dance around each other forever." "We're done dancing," Daniel said, keeping his arm around May. "From now on, we're just moving forward." "Good," Samuel said, "because this valley needs more people willing to fight for each other. Today proved that." As the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, Daniel and May walked back toward their horses. His leg was stiff and painful, her whole body ached, and they were both going to need real medical attention once they got home. But they were alive. They were together. And somehow, against all odds, they'd found a way through the darkness back into light. The ride back to the ranches that evening was slow and careful, both of them too exhausted to push the horses beyond a walk. Daniel's leg throbbed with every step his gelding took, and he could see May wincing periodically as her own aches made themselves known. But neither complained. They were alive, and that was enough. When they reached the fork in the road where they usually parted ways, Daniel pulled his horse to a stop. "Come to my place tonight," he said. "I don't want you alone after what we just went through." May looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing propriety against exhaustion, convention against desire. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but I need to check on Ha-Yun first, make sure he has water and feed for the night. I'll come with you." They rode to May's ranch together, and Daniel waited while she tended to the stallion. Ha-Yun came to the fence immediately when he heard her voice, nickering softly and pushing his nose against her shoulder. She leaned into him, and Daniel saw her shoulders shake with silent sobs. "Hey," he said softly, climbing down from his horse despite his protesting leg. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right, and that's what's terrifying." She turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. "I almost lost you today. We both almost died. And all I could think in that tunnel was that I'd finally found something worth living for, and I was going to lose it before I even had a chance to hold on to it properly." Daniel crossed to her and pulled her close. "But we didn't die. We made it out. This time. But what about next time? What about all the 100 ways this valley can kill us? Accidents, weather, illness, violence." Her voice was muffled against his chest. "How do people bear it? Loving someone when you know you could lose them any moment? The same way we bear everything else. One day at a time, hoping for the best and dealing with the worst if it comes." He stroked her hair, feeling the grit of mine dust still caught in the strands. Sarah used to say that love isn't about guarantees, it's about showing up anyway, even when you're scared. May pulled back to look at him. She sounds like she was wise. She had her moments, Daniel smiled. I think she'd like you. I think she'd approve of this, of us. Do you really believe that? Or are you just saying it to make yourself feel better? Both, maybe. But mostly, I believe it because Sarah wanted me to be happy, and you make me happy in ways I thought I'd forgotten how to be. They stood there in the gathering darkness, holding each other while Hayun watched over them like a guardian. Finally, May stepped back and wiped her eyes. Let me get some things. I'll stay at your place tonight. Daniel's house felt different with May in it. Smaller somehow, but also warmer. She moved through the space with cautious curiosity, taking in the details he'd stopped seeing years ago. Sarah's sampler on the wall, the rocking chair by the fireplace, the carefully preserved stillness of a home that had stopped evolving when its heart stopped beating. You've kept everything exactly as it was, May observed. It wasn't a criticism, just a statement of fact. I know. I've been thinking about that lately, about how I've been living in a museum, just like you were. He lowered himself into a chair, his injured leg stretched out in front of him. Maybe it's time we both started making changes. What kind of changes? The kind that honor the past without being imprisoned by it. He looked around the room. Sarah's things can stay, the ones that matter. But maybe I can add new things too, make space for a future instead of just preserving the past. May sat down across from him, her expression thoughtful. When I first started meeting you at the creek, I thought you were the loneliest person I'd ever seen, even lonelier than me. But you hid it better, wrapped it up in silence and routine. And now? Now I think you were just waiting, not consciously maybe, but waiting for a reason to start living again instead of just existing. Daniel considered that. What about you? What were you waiting for? Permission, May said simply. Permission to let go of guilt, to stop punishing myself, to believe I deserved a second chance at happiness. She smiled sadly. It took a Chinese widow and a grieving cowboy to teach each other that we didn't need anyone's permission but our own. They talked late into the night, tending each other's injuries and sharing stories they'd never told anyone else. May spoke about the shame she'd felt coming to America, about being seen as less than human by people who didn't understand her language or culture. Daniel told her about the farm in Missouri, about a father who drank and a mother who died too young, about learning to survive through silence and hard work. We're both survivors, May said as the fire burned down to embers. That's what drew us together, I think. We recognize that quality in each other. Maybe, but I think it's more than that. Daniel shifted in his chair, trying to ease his aching leg. I think we saw possibilities in each other, ways we could be better, stronger, more ourselves. Is that what love is? Seeing possibilities? Part of it, maybe. The rest is choosing to show up for those possibilities every day, even when it's hard. May stood and crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. Then I choose this. I choose you, choose us, choose whatever future we can build together, even knowing it might hurt, that we might lose each other the way we lost them, especially knowing that. Her grip tightened. Because the alternative is to live half a life, always holding back, always protecting ourselves from pain. And that's not living at all. Daniel pulled her down to sit on the arm of his chair, wrapping an arm around her waist. I love you, May. And I'm done being careful, done measuring out my feelings in safe doses. I want all of it. The joy, the fear, the risk, the reward. Good, she said, and kissed him with a fierceness that took his breath away. Because I want that too. They fell asleep in that chair together, wrapped around each other like survivors of a shipwreck clinging to the same piece of driftwood. And when morning came, pale and cold through the windows, Daniel woke to find May still there, still solid and warm against him, and felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for 2 long years. Over the following weeks, they began the work of weaving their separate lives together. It wasn't always smooth. There were moments of friction when grief resurfaced unexpectedly, when old habits clashed with new routines, when the ghosts of their lost love seemed to crowd the spaces between them. But they learned to navigate those moments with honesty and patience. When May found herself comparing Daniel to Liang, she said so, and they talked about it until the comparison lost its power. When Daniel caught himself trying to make May fit into Sarah-shaped spaces in his life, he acknowledged it and they found new shapes together. The valley watched their courtship with a mixture of approval and curiosity. Some of the older women clucked about propriety, about how soon it was after their losses, about the impropriety of a white man and a Chinese woman together. But most people, especially those who'd witnessed their courage at the mine, saw something worth celebrating. "You two are good for each other," Mrs. Patterson told them one day when they came into town for supplies. "Anyone with eyes can see that. And after what you did for my Tom and the others, you've earned the right to find happiness however you choose." Samuel Garrett was more direct. "Stop worrying about what people think and just live your lives. You've both paid enough dues to grief and loneliness." The first real test came when Daniel suggested they combine their ranches. They were sitting by the creek, their spot, their sacred morning ground, when he raised the idea. "It doesn't make sense to keep running two separate operations," he said. "We're already spending more time together than apart, and combining resources would make both places stronger." May was quiet for a long moment, staring at the water. "Which ranch would we live on? Yours or mine?" "I don't know. Does it matter?" "Yes." She turned to face him. "Because Liang built that ranch with his own hands. Every fence post, every building, it's his legacy, and I'm not ready to abandon it." "I'm not asking you to abandon it. I'm asking us to build something new that honors both what we've lost and what we're creating." "How?" Daniel had been thinking about this for days. "We make your place the main house. It's got better land for that garden you want to plant. We use my barn for the cattle. It's bigger and in better repair. We split the work, combine the herds, and create something that's ours, not his or hers, but ours." May chewed her lip, considering. "And Liang's things? His altar, his photographs, his tools? They stay. They're part of who you are, part of your history. Same as Sarah's things in my house. We're not erasing our pasts. We're just making room for our future alongside them." "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple. It's terrifying. But I think it's right." He took her hand. "I don't want two separate lives that occasionally intersect. I want one shared life. I want to wake up next to you every morning and work beside you every day and build something that's bigger than either of us alone." May's eyes filled with tears. "I want that too. I'm just scared of losing myself in it, of becoming just Daniel's wife instead of May." "Then we make sure that doesn't happen. We build something where you're still fully yourself, where I'm fully myself, and where together we're something even better." They sealed the agreement with a kiss, right there by the creek where they'd first started learning each other's edges and boundaries. And over the following months, they began the work of combining their lives in truth. Daniel moved his essential belongings to May's ranch, but they kept his house intact as a storage building and workspace. May rearranged her home to accommodate both their possessions, creating a space that honored both Liang and Sarah while making room for the life she and Daniel were building. The hardest moment came when May suggested taking down Liang's altar. "Not getting rid of it," she clarified when she saw Daniel's expression. "Just moving it to a smaller space, making it personal instead of the centerpiece of the house." They moved it together to a quiet corner of the bedroom, where May could still honor Liang's memory privately, but where it didn't dominate their shared living space. As Daniel helped her rearrange the offerings, he understood the magnitude of what she was doing, choosing the living over the dead, the future over the past. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For being brave enough to change, for trusting me enough to let me into your space and your life." May touched Liang's photograph one last time before stepping back. "I think he would have liked you. You're different from him in almost every way, but the core things, the decency, the quiet strength, the ability to see what needs doing and do it, those are the same. I hope I can live up to that." "You already do." Spring came early that year, arriving in a rush of green growth and warm winds that turned the valley from brown to emerald almost overnight. True to her word, May planted a garden, not a practical vegetable plot, though that was part of it, but also flowers. Bright, impractical, beautiful flowers that served no purpose except to bring joy. Daniel helped her turn the soil, build raised beds, and plan out the space. They worked side by side in the warming sun, their hands in the earth, building something that would bloom and grow and require tending. It felt like a metaphor for everything they were creating together. Ling would have hated this, May said one afternoon as they planted marigolds along the border. He'd say it was a waste of water and space. But you're not planting it for Liang. You're planting it for yourself. For us, she corrected. I want beautiful things around us. I want color and life and growth. The garden wasn't the only thing growing. Word spread through the valley that Daniel Cross and Lin Mei were planning to marry, and opinions ran the full spectrum from enthusiastic support to quiet disapproval. But they'd learned not to let other people's opinions dictate their choices. The wedding itself was small and simple, held at their ranch on a warm day in late spring. Samuel Garrett stood up with Daniel while Mrs. Patterson stood with May. A traveling minister performed the ceremony, speaking words about love and commitment and choosing each other every day. But the moment that mattered most to both of them came before the ceremony, when they stood together in front of Liang's altar and Sarah's photograph, which they'd placed side by side. "We're not forgetting you," May said softly, speaking to Liang's image. "We're not replacing what we had. We're just choosing to keep living, to keep loving, to honor your memories by building something new." Daniel touched Sarah's photograph gently. "You told me once that I needed to learn how to be happy alone before I could be happy with someone else. I think I've done that. And I think you'd be glad I found May. I think you'd tell me to hold on to her and not let fear steal what we could have together." They stood in silence for a moment, paying respects to the past before turning to face the future. Then they walked outside to where their small gathering of friends and neighbors waited, and they spoke vows that promised partnership, respect, and love for whatever time they were given. When the minister declared them married, Daniel kissed May with the kind of tenderness that spoke of second chances and hard-won wisdom. And the valley, which had witnessed so much of their grief and struggle, witnessed their joy too. The celebration afterward was modest. Food and music and dancing in the yard as the sun set over the mountains. Heiyun watched from his corral, calm and content. The wild grief that had defined him for so long finally settled into something like peace. "He's beautiful when he's not suffering," May observed, standing beside Daniel and watching the stallion move gracefully through the corral. "So are you," Daniel said. She smiled and leaned against him. "So are you." As the party wound down and guests began to depart, Tom Patterson approached them with something in his hands, a framed photograph. "My mother wanted you to have this," he said, offering it to May. "It's from the day we all thought we were going to lose me and my father. Someone took a picture of you and Daniel right after you came out of the mine, and Ma thought you should have it." May took the frame and studied the image. It showed her and Daniel covered in dirt and exhaustion, holding on to each other like the world might shake them apart if they let go. Their faces were streaked with tears and mine dust. Their clothes were torn and filthy, and they looked absolutely destroyed and absolutely in love. "Thank you," May said, her voice thick. "This is perfect." After the last guest had gone and the yard was quiet again, Daniel and May walked through their shared property, looking at everything with new eyes. The house that was now their home, the barn that sheltered their combined herd, the garden that was just beginning to show the first hints of what it would become. "Are you happy?" Daniel asked as they stood on the porch in the gathering darkness. May considered the question seriously. "I'm content and grateful and hopeful. I think happiness is made up of those things, accumulated over time through small moments of choosing each other." "That sounds about right." They sat on the porch steps, shoulders touching, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and Haiyun answered with a soft nicker from the corral. "I keep thinking about that day in the mine," May said quietly, "about how close we came to losing everything before we'd barely started." "No, we didn't, though. We made it out. But we might not have. And the thing is, even knowing that, even knowing we could lose each other tomorrow or next week or next year, I'd still choose this. I'd still choose us." Daniel pulled her closer. "So would I. Every time, without hesitation." They sat in peaceful silence until the night grew cold enough to drive them inside. The house welcomed them with warmth and the smell of the dinner they'd shared with friends. And as they prepared for bed, Daniel felt a sense of rightness that he thought was lost to him forever. In the bedroom, they passed Liang's altar, and Daniel paused to look at the photograph. A stranger's face looked back at him, but not an enemy, just a man who'd loved the same woman Daniel now loved, who'd built a life that Daniel was now helping to continue. "I'll take care of her," Daniel said quietly to the image. "I promise you that." May came up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist. "He knows. And Sarah knows you'll be all right now. They both know we're going to be all right." That night, lying in bed with May's head on his chest and her breathing soft and steady, Daniel thought about the journey that had brought them here. The grief and the loneliness, the tentative morning meetings by the creek, the slow building of trust, the moment in the mine when he'd thought he'd lost her before he'd truly had her. All of it had been necessary. All of it had shaped them into people who could appreciate what they'd found in each other. The months that followed fell into a rhythm that was both new and comfortable. They woke early and worked the land together, Daniel's quiet competence complementing May's careful attention to detail. The garden thrived under her care, producing not just vegetables for their table, but flowers that filled the house with color and fragrance. Haiyun, who'd spent so long locked in grief and rage, gradually relaxed into his old self. May rode him regularly now, and the sight of them moving together across the valley, woman and horse in perfect harmony, became a familiar one to their neighbors. "It's like he finally remembered what it felt like to live instead of just survive," May said one evening after a long ride. "Same as us," Daniel observed. The ranch prospered in ways neither of them had managed alone. Daniel's practical knowledge of cattle and land management combined with May's careful record-keeping and planning created an operation that was both productive and sustainable. They weren't rich, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were building something that would last. One warm summer evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Daniel had his arm around May's shoulders, and she was leaning into him with the easy comfort of long familiarity. "I've been thinking about the future," May said. "About what comes next." "What kind of thinking?" "The kind that involves legacy. What we'll leave behind when we're gone." She turned to look at him. "I want to make this place into something that matters. Not just a ranch, but something that helps people. Maybe we could take in young people who need work and a place to stay. Teach them ranching skills. Give them the kind of second chance we gave each other." Daniel considered the idea. That would mean expanding the operation, building more housing, taking on more responsibility. "I know, but I think we're ready for it. And I think Liang would have approved. He always said the purpose of success was to lift others up with you." Sarah said something similar. She believed in paying forward the help we'd received. He smiled. "I think it's a good idea, a way to make our happiness serve a purpose beyond just ourselves." They started small, taking on one young man from town, a boy named James whose father had died in the mine collapse, leaving his mother struggling to support 3 children. James was angry and grieving and lost. But Daniel saw something of himself in the boy's wounded pride. "You work hard, you learn what we teach you, and you'll have a place here as long as you need it," Daniel told him on his first day. "We're not charity. We're family." It took time for James to trust them, to believe they meant what they said. But slowly, through consistent example and patient teaching, he began to soften. May worked with him in the garden, teaching him that growing things required attention and care, not just force. Daniel taught him horsemanship and cattle management, showing him that strength was less important than understanding. By the end of summer, James was a different boy, still grieving, still scarred, but no longer lost. And when his mother came to visit and saw her son smiling again, she wept with gratitude. "You've given him back to me," she told May. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," May said. "Someone gave us both second chances. We're just passing it forward." Word spread, and other families began asking if Daniel and May might take on their children, not because they didn't love them, but because they saw what the ranch was becoming. A place of healing, a place where grief could transform into purpose. Over the next 2 years, they expanded carefully, never taking on more than they could handle, always making sure each young person got the attention and care they needed. Some stayed for months, others for years. Some left to start their own ranches, armed with knowledge and confidence they'd lacked when they arrived. A few stayed on permanently, becoming part of the extended family that the ranch was becoming. Through it all, Daniel and May maintained the rituals that had brought them together. They still met by the creek most mornings, though now it was to steal a few moments of quiet before the day's work began. They still talked about their lost loves, but the conversations were gentler now, less about grief and more about gratitude for what had been. "Do you think Sarah would recognize you now?" May asked one morning as they sat by the water. Daniel considered the question. "I think she'd recognize the core of me, but she'd be surprised by how much I've changed. I'm more patient now, less driven, more willing to let things unfold instead of trying to control them." "Dang wouldn't recognize me at all," May said with a small smile. "I used to be so worried about what everyone thought, so concerned with being proper and acceptable. Now I wear men's trousers when I work, I speak my mind in town meetings, and I run a ranch with my white husband without apologizing to anyone." "You think he'd disapprove?" "No, I think he'd be proud. He always wanted me to be stronger, braver. He just didn't live long enough to see me become those things." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the creek flow past on its eternal journey to somewhere else. The water had been here before them and would be here long after, indifferent to human joy and sorrow. There was comfort in that, Daniel thought, in knowing that some things persisted regardless of what happened to fragile human hearts. 5 years after their wedding, on a crisp autumn morning with the valley dressed in gold and crimson, Daniel and May stood at the fence of the main corral and watched as Hayun ran freely across the pasture. The stallion was older now, with silver beginning to show in his black coat, but he still moved with grace and power. "I can't believe we almost lost him," May said, "that he was so close to being destroyed by grief that we thought he'd never recover." "Same thing could be said about us," Daniel replied. "True." She took his hand. "But we did recover. All three of us. We found our way back to life." Around them, the ranch bustled with activity. James, now a young man of 22, was working with 2 newer arrivals, teaching them the same skills he'd learned. In the garden, a teenage girl named Mary was harvesting vegetables with May's patient guidance echoing in her careful movements. The barn was being repaired by another young man whose carpentry skills were slowly returning after an accident had taken his father and his confidence. "We've built something good here," Daniel said, "something that matters." "We've built a family," May corrected, "not through blood, but through choice and care and showing up every day." That evening, they gathered everyone for dinner, a tradition they'd established early on, where no matter how busy the day had been, they all sat down together to share food and conversation. The table was loud with laughter and stories, with the kind of easy camaraderie that came from working side by side toward common goals. After dinner, as the younger people cleaned up and prepared for their evening chores, Daniel and May slipped away to the porch. It had become their sanctuary, this spot where they could watch the sun set over their shared domain and reflect on the day. "Do you ever regret it?" May asked. "Choosing this life with me instead of staying in your comfortable grief?" "Never, not once." Daniel pulled her close. "You gave me back my life. You showed me that loving again didn't mean betraying what I'd lost. It meant honoring it by refusing to waste what I'd been given. You did the same for me, and for Hayun, and now for all these young people who come here broken and leave whole." She rested her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes I think about that first morning I saw you by the creek, and I wonder what would have happened if you'd just walked away. If you'd decided it wasn't your business, that a grieving Chinese widow and her dangerous horse were problems you didn't need. I couldn't walk away. Something in me recognized something in you. We were mirrors of each other's pain, and that made us the only people who could truly see each other. Do you think we would have found each other if we hadn't both lost our first loves? If we'd met when we were younger, happier, less broken?" Daniel thought about that. "I don't know. Maybe we needed to be broken first, needed to understand loss before we could appreciate what we'd found. Sarah and Liang, they shaped us into people who could love each other the way we do now. Then I'm grateful to them for loving us, for leaving us, for making us into people who could find each other in the wreckage." They watched the stars emerge, the same stars that had witnessed their grief and their healing, their cautious approach, and eventual surrender to love. The valley was quiet, except for the usual evening sounds: cattle settling, horses nickering to each other, the distant call of an owl beginning its nightly hunt. "I'm happy," May said simply, "not in spite of everything we've been through, but because of it. The grief made the joy deeper, more precious. I don't take a single moment for granted." Neither do I, Daniel said. Every morning I wake up next to you feels like a gift I didn't earn, but somehow received anyway. Inside the house, they could hear the young people talking and laughing as they finished their evening tasks. The sounds of life, of continuity, of hope persisting despite every reason to give up. We should go in, May said eventually. Make sure everyone's settled for the night. But they lingered a moment longer, holding each other in the darkness. Two people who'd learned that love didn't end with death. It transformed, evolved, made room for new love alongside old. Sarah and Liang weren't forgotten. They lived on in the lessons they'd taught, in the people Daniel and May had become, in the legacy of choosing life over surrender. When they finally went inside, the house welcomed them with warmth and light and the beautiful chaos of a home filled with people who'd found refuge in each other's company. This was what they'd built from the ashes of their losses, not a replacement for what they'd had, but something entirely new, something forged in grief and tempered by love, as strong as it was beautiful. That night, as they prepared for bed, May paused in front of the small corner where Liang's altar still stood, though it was much simpler now than it had been. A photograph, a stick of incense, a cup of tea. Across the room, Sarah's picture hung beside it, the two of them keeping watch together over the life their surviving loves had built. "Thank you," May whispered to both of them, "for everything you gave us, for everything you taught us, for letting us go so we could find each other." Daniel came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. Together they stood in that sacred space between past and present, honoring what had been while celebrating what was. And in the morning they would wake with the sun and return to the creek, their beginning place, their constant. They would drink coffee and talk about the day ahead, about the work that needed doing and the dreams they were still building. They would touch Ha-Yun's nose through the fence and watch him run free across the pasture, strong and whole again. They would live, fully, completely, without apology or reservation. They would love each other with the fierce appreciation of people who'd learned firsthand that nothing was guaranteed, that every moment was borrowed, that happiness was something you had to choose actively every single day. And in choosing each other, in choosing life, in choosing to build something beautiful from the broken pieces they'd been handed, Daniel Cross and Lin May would prove that grief's purpose wasn't to destroy. It was to teach you what mattered, to strip away everything false and leave only truth. The truth that love persisted, that hope could be rebuilt, that two people who'd lost everything could find everything they needed in each other, in hard work, in the valley that had witnessed both their darkest moments and their brightest days. The black stallion ran free. The garden bloomed with impossible colors. The creek flowed on, patient and eternal. And two survivors who'd learned to live again woke each morning grateful for the second chances they'd almost been too afraid to take, the love they'd almost been too broken to accept, and the future they'd built together, one careful, courageous choice at a time.